My name is Mike Traugott, and I'm the director of the Center for Political Studies. And I want to thank you all for coming today to help us in the center commemorate the career of our colleague, Jim Morrow. I've only been the director for about a month, and I had very little to do with the arrangements for today's event. This is primarily the work of Ken Coleman. And so I'm going to turn the microphone over to Ken so that he can be the master of ceremonies for this afternoon's events. Thanks again.
Thanks, everybody. As Mike said, I was director of CPS for until about a month ago, and enjoyed working with Jim and organizing this. And also I wanted to, this is a joint event between the Political Science Department, Andy Murphy Chair in the back, and CPS. So gratitude to them. So just some logistical issues. The way that the speakers and the events will go, we'll have 3 talks we've allocated for each session. There's 2 sessions of 3 speakers each. Each speaker is allocated 1/2 hour. If they go shorter, they can do Q&A during that 1/2 hour, but otherwise we'll go through the talks and then we'll have Q&A after. We'll have a break. I'm told there's coffee coming at the break. So that's hopefully that'll work out. And so we'll have 2 of those sessions. We'll end around 5 today. Looking very much forward to all of this. So Jim and I have been working on this for a while. It's been great to do. It's an honor really to be here to celebrate Jim. As Mike said, I'm Ken Coleman. I've been Jim's colleague here for 25 years, counting. While I was director, I worked with Jim and others to organize this. Jim's been a presence in my professional life since my career began in the early 90s, when we crossed paths at conferences, mostly public choice, and mostly because I used his game theory textbook to teach quite a few courses in our department and in ICPSR. And then he rejoined the faculty in 2000, and we've been colleagues ever since. A quick rundown. After Jim earned his PhD at Rochester, he was an assistant professor here at Michigan in the 1980s, and then scooted off to Hoover at Stanford for 11 years, and then returned in 2000 here. We were fortunate to bring him back. Since 2013, he's been the A.F.K. Organski Collegiate Professor of World Politics. Jim has made his mark on this place and on the profession. Others are going to comment on his impact on the rough and tumble academic subdiscipline in the study of international relations, otherwise known as world politics. We all know that Jim's impact is very large indeed, and while we'll celebrate his accomplishments today as he enters formal retirement, he likes to tell others that his career is not really ending. It's just sunsetting his teaching and committee responsibilities, and he's going to say a little bit more later about what's up with him, what he has planned. What can I say personally about Jim? Let me just say that really I have the utmost respect for you. I'm really delighted that your family's here. Several words come to mind immediately when I reflect on my overlap with Jim. Say words: integrity, intelligence, honesty, conscientiousness, and impact. He always held up his end and more in collaborative work in the department, in service, and I know in his research collaborations. Jim is a consummate professional. He always agreed to tasks that I asked him to do when I was director of the center. Thank you. Few of us relish working on committees, and we consider it a duty, but it was more tolerable to serve on a committee with Jim because he always tells it straight, does his homework, and behaves in a collegial manner. Now, if you know Jim, he can turn on a dime between being serious and being fun and a lot of games and humor. He's always been welcoming along with Karen at their beautiful home. He cooks a mean meal on the grill and in his smoker. But there's one aspect for which I feel very sorry for Jim. His favorite professional sports teams, the Bears and the Ducks, for instance, have made you suffer for many years.
Sharks.
Oh, sorry. Did I get that wrong?
Sharks.
The Sharks. Sorry. It's over there. I don't remember. The Sharks. Apologies. They still make you suffer. Yeah, you're right. I wish better times for you, for your professional teams. So I really look forward to the presentations today and celebrating him the rest of the day. And the speakers can we've given them carte blanche to talk about their work and about Jim. I think most of them are going to talk about their research and work. So this will be tons of fun, and I look forward to it. Our first speaker. Well, let me say who the first three speakers are, and then I will cede the. Okay. So Alistair Smith is the Bernhard Denmark Chair of International Relations at New York University. He hold his PhD from the University of Rochester and a BA in chemistry from Oxford. He focuses on international relations, comparative politics, and political economy. His work with our second speaker, Bruce Bueno de Mesquita, Jim, and Randy Stephenson on selectorate theory is, of course, very famous and very widespread across the social sciences in terms of its impact. The theory explains why leaders in different political systems behave the way they do. Smith is a recipient of multiple grants and a Karl Deutsch Award. He's authored numerous books, including the one I mentioned, The Logic of Political Survival. But one in particular stuck out to me, The Dictator's Handbook, Why Bad Behavior is Almost Always Good Politics. Been thinking a lot about that lately. Our second speaker, Bruce Bueno de Mesquita, is the Julius Silver Professor of Politics at NYU and a founding partner in Selectors, a consulting firm, using game theory models to address government and business problems. Got his doctorate here at the University of Michigan. I won't say the year. And he has various honorary doctorates. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a former Guggenheim Fellow, and won the South Korea's DMZ Peace Prize. He was former president of the International Studies Association. And Jessica Sarah Sun is an assistant professor of political science at Emory University and a Glenn Campbell, Rita Ricardo Campbell National Fellow at Hoover. Her research focuses on civil conflict, repression, authoritarian regimes, and evaluating the causes of political violence. Her recent work primarily uses game theory models to study the intersection of economic, civil conflict, and the domestic and international consequences of repression. So thank you to these three speakers. I'll introduce the next three before the first session. So Alistair, come on up, please.
Well, this is going to be fun. I didn't recognize that distinguished person Ken was talking about. How do I make the slides come?
You want to use this thing, right? You want to use this?
Not really. I was just going to be loud, but
Speakers, if you're going to walk, use the thing.
oh dear, oh dear. Okay, well, I had hoped that this was just going to be a thinly disguised excuse to talk about Jim and what lovely work he did, but Ken told me that wasn't acceptable and I actually had to do a real talk about real work. So I thought I would present some work that I've been doing with Bruce, but a lot of this follows from work that I collaborated with Jim. Unfortunately, I'm going to say more than 20 years ago. Would that be? I'm feeling old. Okay, so I want to think about beware of new leaders. And I think I like this picture because I want to get that guy's shirt. But these guys are just showing how happy they are at Robert Mugabe disappearing after 37 years of rule. They seem very, very happy. And this seems to be a big general theme that when we get new leaders, everyone's sort of excited where the world is going to be better. We're going to have reform, peace will break out. There'll be liberty and freedom. And I'm sort of you can see when my last time I bought a record was some time ago, you know, meet the old boss, the new boss, same as the old boss. But the thing we want to emphasize in this work, the key is he might be exactly the same in every characteristics, but he's new. And so he's going to behave very differently. So we're going to develop what I'm going to think of as a political life cycle. And so I just thought I'd give you another more recent contrast. So this is from 2024. The Syria scored 1 out of 100 in terms of press freedom and freedom of assembly, according to Freedom House. And yet this is a picture when we get rid of Bashar al-Assad gets kicked out. Everyone's suddenly allowed to be free, and we get all these reforms. But I want to point out that this is going to turn back to this after a decade or so. Well, over time, we're going to move from here to here. And that's basically the purpose of today's talk. Okay, so we're going to develop a model of political life cycles. We're going to tell you that as tenure increases, leaders find it easier to survive in office. They're going to spend less. They're going to do more public stuff. Corruption's going to grow. Public goods is going to go down. Coups and revolutions become less likely. I can offer some little bit of evidence here about ill health. The trend is going to reverse if you're known to be terminally ill. And we're basically going to look at the dynamics of new leaders. And the key here is new leaders come in, they start reshuffling, they try and get the old guard out and replace them with their friends. And so when you've got established leaders, they can credibly promise to pay people with corruption. New leaders don't have that luxury. And so they rely on doing things like letting people talk to each other and providing public goods. That's basically the talk. So it all sort of comes out of this stuff. And so this is a good excuse to talk about work with Jim. We're going to think about a winning coalition. This is the set of people you need to stay in power. And we're really interested in the size of this. And we think of, we might think of this in the US, and you're like 22 million people to win the presidency out of all the voters. Okay? And so what our leaders are going to do, they're going to provide public and private goods. And the sort of core intuitions that were developed in work with Jim was that when the coalition is large, it's very inefficient to give people corrupt goods, to hand out prizes. It's just there's not enough money to go around. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a public goods focus. Political freedoms, clean environment, national defense, and things like that. But as coalition gets small, we're going to go to private goods. Okay, so what we want, those ideas in this sort of theory we had about affinity. So this is the idea that we idiosyncratically have likes and dislikes for each other. And in the early work, we just thought, oh, everything, the maths seem to have got a bit screwed up here. Anyway, the idea is we thought about this sort of being revealed. When the new leader comes to power, they suddenly find out who their friends are and everything. Instantly, we kick out the old guard and bring in our new friends. In here, the intuition in this model is we're going to think about this affinity as being slowly learnt over time. So we don't know who we like, or we might think we do know, but we've got to it takes time to get opportunities to push people out, bring people in. Okay, so we're going to look at this replacement risk. I only need W people out of S. And so when I first come to power, I'll take support from anyone who can help me get to power. But once I'm in, I would like to kick out those people who I don't like. And so this is the intuition that we developed with Jim. But now we're going to try and actually model that as a learning process. So that's what I'm going to do today. So we're going to have a simple game. We're just going to have lots of infinitely repeated game until the leader's removed from power, the game ends. And in each period, the leader's going to sort of announce three things. The number of people they're going to reward, which is going to be always be bigger than the minimum they need. A provision of public goods, a provision of private goods. The selectors are then going to decide whether they're going to back the leader or not. And if at least W of them are loyal, then the leader's going to survive in power. Otherwise, the leader's replaced. And for some reason, I don't know what happened here, but we're going to see another signal. In each period, we're going to get the leader and the voters, or the citizens or whatever, they're all going to get a signal about their affinity for each other, which is supposed to be normally distributed, focused around. So we're going to have a distribution on affinity. This is this letter A. all the maths has disappeared, but we're going to have this distribution. I'm going to get a noisy signal around this. In each period, I'm going to get it. And if I'm the leader, what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of rank order everyone from the guys I think like me the most, because they're naturally going to be loyal. So it's a good place to build a coalition. And I'm going to reward the highest set of people. So some people might get pushed out the coalition. That's the intuition. Okay, this completely disappeared. I do not know.
Turn it into a PDF. Did you not proofread these?
It's perfect on my computer. I don't know. It's I sent you a PDF. I sent it a PDF. Yeah. Who knows? Anyway, fine. I can give you the idea. We're going to have a signal. I'm going to update my beliefs about my affinity with you. Okay. And then what I can do is just rank order everyone. I'm from highest to lowest. Okay. And then I'm going to reward the top guys because they're going to be naturally loyal to me. Okay. The key intuition, which again we can't really see, is to think about what is the likelihood of my changing in this rank. So since none of that maths appeared, let me go straight to a picture. So this is sort of all the logic is here. Let's suppose I need to keep 20% of the people loyal in order to survive in power. Okay. And so the key thing is the guys at the top of my ranking, they're going to be naturally loyal. They like me and they know that I like them, and therefore they're going to likely be around for a while. So these are going to be the most loyal people. These people just want to have me executed for a moment. But the question is, so if this person's loyal, the minimum size I need, I'm going to have enough supporters. So they're also going to be all about keeping the person who ranks the sort of W highest person in the coalition loyal. The problem is I'm going to actually learn more information about how much I like people over time, and that's going to shift the rank order. But it's going to shift the rank order a lot more when I first come to power. Okay, so this is the idea of the CDF of the ranking. So let's suppose, for example, I'm at this critical, I'm this guy, I'm this supporter here. What's the probability that I'm going to be rewarded with private goods? If the leader, for example, is going to reward 30% of the people with private goods. So that's basically the idea of what signal would I have to see to move me from this position to be below here so I don't get any private goods. So that's the intuition, and it took me a really long time to figure it out, but it's actually just not much more than some Bayesian updates, but it's a little tricky, right? So in the first period, there's like a 30% chance that if I was this person, I'd get kicked out of the coalition, I wouldn't get any goodies. But over time, we're going to see that the probability of this person being kicked out of the coalition is going to go down because the signal I'd need to give me enough information to shunt me from like 80th to 70th in the list is just so huge. And in the end, we get this sort of step function. So that's all the intuition you need in terms of maths. So it's good because there isn't any maths, right? It's all disappeared. Okay. What happened? What did I do? Okay. Okay, so there's a theorem that, again, you can't read. So it's basically going to turn out that the ratio of public to private goods is going to be driven by the things that we did with Jim, which was the ratio of the cost of public goods. That's how easy it is to produce, and the size of the coalition. But we're also going to factor in is we're going to discount that by the probability that you're going to get these things. So if you're that critical supporter, what's the chance that you're going to get out of the coalition in the immediate period? And we're going to do this discounted down the line, but that's the intuition. So early on, if we looked at the picture, we saw there's a 30% chance I'm not going to get these goods. So private goods are a relatively poor way of rewarding someone because in expectation, they're only going to get them 70% of the time. Once I've got to here, as n goes to, as tenure goes to infinity, the chances are the person's almost certainly going to get these goods. And so they become a reliable way to reward people. So that's all the intuition we probably need, and you can't read the theorem. So this is the sort of picture. Over time, as tenure goes up, we're going to see this is sort of spending in total, how much resources I have to spend to keep everybody loyal. Public goods are going to go down. Private goods, we've actually got two effects going on. We've got a substitution effect. As I can more reliably convince people they're going to get private goods, they become relatively valuable. So I substitute from public goods to private goods. But we also see an effect here that they're decreasing is I don't have to spend as much once people know that they're going to be rewarded. So we can see both substitution and an effort sort of the level of spending going down. So those are the effects we see there. The next thing we wanted to do was actually play around with this idea of how many people am I actually going to reward, right? So I just did that example where I needed 20% of the people, but I rewarded 30%. Well, that might be a really smart thing to do when people have a good chance of slipping way down the rank ordering. But as they become more and more certain, the rank ordering becomes more and more solidified because we've already got all the learning's been done effectively, I can actually reduce the size of the coalition. And again, the maths has all disappeared, but the key intuition here is I can make the coalition smaller and smaller over time. So I've literally just done a graph of this. So this is the ratio of private goods to public goods. And over time, it's in this particular sort of the same numbers I had in the other graph, just for comparison. But we see we're going to shift this by like 5. The ratio is going to change by a factor of 5 over time. And the actual size of the coalition that we have is going to get closer and closer to the minimum number of people that I actually need. Okay, so that's all the intuition. So we have a ton of predictions sort of coming out of this. New leaders come in, how do they behave relative to the old leader, right? What do we see when Robert Mugabe comes? Well, the new leader is going to come in and they're going to reward more people. They're going to actively shuffle the coalition. Mugabe had tons of time to get rid of all the upstarts who brought him in, and he had his old legacy cronies. They're going to have to spend more. They're going to spend on public goods and freedom and not on private goods. And they get deposed a lot because people aren't that loyal because they're only getting the private goods probabilistically. But as tenure goes on, what are we going to do? We're going to contract the coalition if we can. We're going to reshuffle the coalition less because we've already learned who we like and who we don't like. So we're not going to change the rank ordering very rapidly. We can spend less. We're not going to spend it on, heaven forbid, we would waste our money on public goods or allow people to talk to each other, right? We're going to spend it on private goods, and we're going to survive in office longer. So that's the intuition. We've a ton of tests, and this will go back to many of the things that we tested and told we did wrong, and then Jim fixed them all in an APSR for us. Looking at the public goods provision, but I thought I'd actually show you something a little unusual because I've been playing around with electricity. So I just thought I'd show you what you might not obviously think of as a public good, but what I want to think about is where does electricity get given? If I was the political leader, I could have the consumer price close to the production cost, and I could make sure all the towns and villages are electrified, and so everyone can have electricity in their house. Alternatively, I could raise the price of electricity, not worry about repairing the grid system, and let my cronies have cheap electricity for their firms. Right? One's got a public focus, one's got a private focus. And there's a great paper about 15 years ago by Brown and Mubarak using this as they show that as we democratize, we end up more electricity gets consumed by the residents and less gets consumed by the industrial sector. In the context we have here, we expect to see the same pattern in terms of tenure. So the longer the leader has been in, we should start shifting away from letting the people have electric in their village and start giving it to our cronies to run their factories to make lots of rents so they're going to be lovely and loyal. It's precisely what we see. As tenure goes up, less and less of the electricity goes to the residential sector. I've just shown the residential here. It goes to the industrial sector. The effects are much bigger in small coalition systems where private goods should be an important component and less important. There's no discernible effect in the largest coalition systems, like I'm going to say the US democracy, but maybe I should, take that with a little effect. The effects are actually quite big. So if we were to think, what's the impact of like going from your first year to your 10th year? It's a reduction of about 5.5% of the electricity in the residential sector. But in a small coalition system, the average usage is about 22%. So there's actually a a quarter of the electricity that will go to the villages and the people in the first year is not going to them by the time the leader's been in 10 years. So the effects are quite big. Anyway, I wanted to show something other than could show you looking at public and private ratio of public and private goods. But again, we're going to find leader change leads us to having much more public goods and much less private goods. We have looked here at what we called elite leader change. So think of this as a coup. When we have a coup, we tend to associate this with losing the coalition size also contracting. So when leaders come in, they do more public stuff and less private, unless we have a coup where, of course, we're contracting the coalition. So we've got that, and we could do the same with political freedoms. Turns out you can explain an enormous amount of the variation in political freedoms by just looking at how long the leader has been in. So Syria looks real nice now. You can go to that square and chat with all your friends about how bad the last guy was. But I bet in a couple of years' time, you go to the same square and chat about how bad the new guy is, you're going to go end up in jail. And that's a pattern that we see and explains a large amount of the variance. Bruce seems to think that we actually can measure coalition size really well, and we're going to find over time that the actual size of coalitions contracts with as tenure increases and jumps back up when we have new leaders. So this is the idea of how many people am I going to reward? I've got like 1 minute, right? 2 minutes? 4 more minutes. Okay. One of the things I pointed out is that the logic for this is that when there's a leader established, we know the rank order of how much we like each other. And that's been learned. And so if you're in the top set, you know you're going to stay in the top set, or you have a very high expectation. The trouble is when a leader gets sick, we know there's going to be a leader replacement, and therefore when the new person comes in, there's going to be a reshuffle. So we actually expect that ill leaders, chronically ill leaders, are actually going to have to reverse that tenure trend. They're going to have to start behaving like new leaders, because effectively they are new leaders because they can't promise this flow of goods. So we just looked here. This is a very simple test we have in a forthcoming book. If anyone has sleeping problems, I recommend this book. It's like this thick and it's all maths. You'll be out for the count. Just a few pages every night. Sleep like a baby. Okay. What we basically were looking at is sort of economic growth over leader change. We show that on average, when we have a leader change, economic growth jumps up by about 1/3%. If you have an acute leader death, so this is someone who dies suddenly, maybe they get COVID or they fall off their horse or they get bitten by their monkey. These are actually ways leaders have died. Then we see like a 2% jump in the growth rate. The argument we're making is that leaders have to try, the new leader comes in and has to try hard, the old leader wasn't trying. But the chronically ill leaders, the ones who we know are close to death, they actually have to work hard because they can't reliably promise this flow of goods. So they're already working hard, just like a new leader. So that's sort of what I wanted to do. This is work that sort of builds on work with Jim. We just assumed in the early models that all the learning took place instantly. I found out who my friends were. I could instantly kick everyone out the coalition. Here we've introduced a learning model, and we've looked at the implications in terms of tenure and the impact of bringing in somebody new. And survival goes up, the provision of goods shifts. New guys do lots of freedoms. Coalition reshuffles. Over time, the rewards go down. So this is sort of just building off work that Jim was foundational in. So, and I'm finished on time, right? Oh, better get that out of my pocket.
Yeah, exactly. There we go. Okay.
It's a live.
You don't want to take that either.
Oh,
what-
I've a whole bunch of like extra stuff.
Which button is going to move me forward?
Yeah, the right one. But
the
I
right
put a bunch of extra stuff.
Whoop, no,
Sorry.
went too far. Okay.
Oh no, that's me.
I am
the
not the Bernhardt.
Okay.
He knew Bernhardt Denmark.
Bernhardt Denmark was actually the president. Oh, Harvard. The White House.
There we go.
I think you're all set.
So before I get started on the new work, I just want to say a few words. This is a very emotional occasion for me. Jim was my student at Rochester in 19, and just across the hall, I did my dissertation defense here, and even earlier than that, when hardly anybody in this room was born. It's very depressing. And Alistair was also my student. I persuaded the leadership at Hoover to bring Jim out to Hoover. And one of the main reasons was Randy Severson and I were beginning the very sort of crude ideas of selectorate theory. And it was pretty clear to us that there was bigger stuff there than what we were doing, but we needed serious help from seriously smart people. Bingo. Yeah, well, people make mistakes. Well, what can I say? There was Jim. And what I want to talk about today is related in part to conversations that we had back then and closely related to the presentation that Alistair just made in good, smart, clever ways. Alistair and I did not coordinate on our presentations. I am presenting newer work than Alistair presented, but closely related. So I start with a little bit of, you got to promote. That's the new book. And you see, you can anticipate the things are going to happen. Alistair and I estimate that 3 people are going to read this book. That would be Alistair, me, and high probability that there's somebody in this room who will be number 3. Okay, so this is our shameless promotion. And the core of this book is that we spend too much time in political science looking at what happens instead of looking at signals about what is coming. And if you are a leader and what is coming is bad news for you, then you want to take actions to offset the anticipated problems. So Alistair was talking about shuffling the coalition and so forth. And really what that's about is anticipating problems, reducing the problems before they happen. So empirically, we don't observe that anything happened. And a lot of people look at that and say, oh, leaders must be irrational. They change the size, how democratic they are in our terms, the size of the winning coalition, or they changed their policies, or they changed how much suppression they're engaging in. Why are they doing that? Nothing's happened. And what this book is about is what are the signals? The things didn't happen because they anticipated. So what I want to talk about, oh my God, we just saw this picture. That's what happened. I want to talk about a particular piece of this picture that will take me back to early discussions with Jim. That's this piece here, blocks. So Alistair just talked about learning affinity and then focused on the implications as you learn affinity. The longer the leader is in office, it has consequences for what they're spending and so forth. And what I want to do in this talk is to take a small step forward from that, to make the observation that the logic is that the longevity of the leader's time in office is a proxy for changes in affinities. And so today I want to talk about affinities themselves directly. Okay, this is, well, just quickly, for those who don't know, selectorate theory, right? There are 2 dimensions. You have a winning coalition. That's the set of people who support you need to stay in power. You have a selectorate. That's the pool from which those people are drawn. Alistair spoke about the ratio of winning coalition, W to selectorate size, S. And the descriptive labels for governments map onto that quite nicely. For example, direct election presidential systems have large selectorates and large winning coalitions. This is not the United States. We do not have a directly elected president. And you sort of move along in these various directions. The key here is that you can locate every government in the world, in fact, every organization, potentially in a unique spot in these two dimensions, as opposed to being categorical. So the theory says that leaders want to stay in office and control revenue. They always face a challenger. The challenger wants to replace the incumbent. There may be revolutionaries who want to depose the incumbent and change the institutions. They always say they're going to democratize. By the way, in anticipating instability in equilibrium, that is what they have to say. And they may be lying, of course. And they may face the threat of coup plots. Those are people who are generally, their interest is in increasing the ratio of winning coalition to selectorate size. Of course, you can do that in several ways. You could shrink both and shrink W faster, slower than S. You could and so on. Okay. And all actions are anticipatory. They're based on expectations. And they're all driven by avoiding things that you can avoid, avoiding bad outcomes. What do leaders do? Leaders do very little in the selectorate theory. They have very simple jobs. They tax and they spend. So they allocate revenue, R, and they, as Alistair just noted, with public goods, G, and private goods, Z. The private goods only go to the coalition. We are now beginning to move in the direction of introducing club goods, which will be a more sophisticated treatment than I'm going to present today, although I'm starting in that direction on what happens when the winning coalition is made up of blocks of support. P is the price of public goods. W is the implicit price of private goods. That is, the bigger the coalition, the more expensive it is to reward people with private goods, with corruption opportunities and so forth. The price of public goods turns out to be a lot more important than any of us thought for a long time. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what its effects are, and I will in passing note that they should give us some optimism for those who are not happy with Mr. Trump, that he will be stopped. So there's an optimal spending level. Unspent revenue is at the leader's discretion. They can sock it away in a secret bank account. They can spend it on civic-minded projects, and those civic-minded projects can be smart, like were the projects for Deng Xiaoping and Lee Kuan Yew, and they can be stupid, like Kwame Nkrumah's or Mao Zedong's. They can do bad to the economy. So you can produce kleptocracy, Swiss bank accounts, and civic-mindedness. All right, there's a budget constraint. We can rearrange it. We see that weekly, as coalition size gets bigger, we should get less corruption, so result in logical political survival. I just want to touch on this before getting to the new stuff, to establish a certain amount of credibility, because that's what the data look like. That's no control variables, nothing, just the VDEM project's measure of private goods access and against our measure of coalition size. And as you can see, with nothing else, just knowing the size of the coalition gives you a very good predictor of corruption. It's a rather tight fit. There are not a lot of outliers. And where there are outliers, they tend to be petrostates, where they have so much money that, they don't need to be as corrupt as otherwise one would think. That's some of these guys over here. All right, there's an incumbency constraint. The leader has to spend enough so that the coalition remains loyal rather than defecting to a rival who is offering more. The challenger makes the best offer they can, but they can't credibly commit. So in the logical political survival variant of that, the probability of being in the winning coalition if you joined the challenger was the ratio of how many people does that leader need, drawn from how large a pool. And as Alistair's just shown you, we've moved from that to seeing that they oversize the coalition, and that oversizing gradually goes away. So the leader gradually identifies and purges people. And so an important difference between what we do in the logical political survival and what we do in anticipating instability is this movement away from W being fixed. Okay, so there's some ugly math. And the nice feature here is, well, mine showed up. Who knows? So here's the derivative of how much the leader has to spend with respect to W. And as you can see, there's a negative and a positive term, and that produces a swoosh curve. And I want to talk a little bit about the swoosh curve as I get to what I want to talk about. So the provision of public goods, P, can be done efficiently or expensively. So if you are efficient at producing public goods, then the minima occurs earlier than if you are not so good at producing public goods, the minima in terms of the rewards to the coalition. And at least as importantly, probably more importantly, the slope is much steeper if you produce public goods efficiently rather than inefficiently. Just as an aside, one of the questions people often ask, at least me, because I used to be an Indianist, is, well, how do you explain India with this? India, after all, is a corrupt society. Well, this is how. Once you know the efficiency with which the government is able to produce public goods, so India is not good at it, you know that this slope is flatter. And that makes keeping people poor more attractive, not the subject we're going to talk about today, but the subject that we're working on. And there's another thing to notice, that not in the right place. This has changed. So this was up here. So there is a cut point, right, where the welfare of the coalition is at least as good as the local maxima when the coalition is big. That is, in my view, Donald Trump's problem, because when you are at that cut point, above that cut point, as the United States is, the number of people who can benefit from contracting the coalition is very small. And the number of people who will benefit is large. Whereas if you're in the sort of India situation, that's not true, because they're not getting much out of the government. So we have a region, which this should be up here, that's a region of instability. That's where coups, revolutions, and so forth happen. They never happen past that cut point. And you see, if you are inefficient, this cut point, it's going to happen someplace out here at a huge coalition. And the longer you're in office, is what Alistair talked about, the more the curve shifts down. So for any given, even if we hold the shape fixed, the reward structure is shifting downward the longer the leader is in office. Okay, that's all by way of warm up to give you a little bit of background. So I want to go beyond life cycles, which I didn't know Alistair was going to be talking about, but I think we're going to do the coup paper, but all right. So we know, you just heard, the longer a leader is in office, the less that the coalition has to be paid, because their confidence of remaining in the coalition and getting future benefits is going up. And the fewer public goods the leader has to provide, but the higher the ratio of private to public goods. That, by the way, is consistent both with the actual level of private goods, of corruption, going up or going down. It's the ratio that has gone up, but of course the total payment is going down, so it could be either way. And reduced probability the leader is going to be overthrown. And as I said, the leader's tenure is not the causal mechanism of these effects. It is a consequence that is correlated with the learning of affinity. And so I want to take a little bit of a step beyond that longevity in office proxy to start talking about what happens when the coalition has blocks in it. Okay, so we have some conjectures from the Logical Political Survival 1964, back in 2003. This is page 64. Jim and I spent a huge amount of time in the late 90s into the early 2000s talking about how to think about blocks in coalitions. We understood that that was going to be important, we also understood it was an awfully hard problem. We talked about the combinatorics involved, well, how many blocks do I need? How big should the blocks be? What is the mix of blocks? How many individuals? It was awful. Had lengthy conversations with a colleague at Hoover, Ken Judd, who's got, as Jim does, superb math skills. And he looked at it and said, I don't know how to do that. Eventually, Alistair and I had a conversation with some people at the Courant Institute at NYU and with Roger Meyerson. And they said, well, no, don't deal with the combinatorics. You're never going to solve that. Think of it as Poisson distributed sized groups with how big the differences between the groups being something called the Skellum distribution. Anyway, we had a lot of conversations, and this led to some conjectures that are in the logical political survival that I want to probe today. So if affinities are highly correlated across individuals within groups, so the block is a meaningful block, the candidate's selection by a single member of the group can serve as a signal to all members of the group. Members of the group follow the lead of their block leader. So the block leader can deliver a bunch of people. Such a circumstance makes it relatively inexpensive to buy support among a few members of large groups, thereby ensuring the reality of a small winning coalition with the appearance of dependence on a large coalition. India also, if anybody's an Indianist in here, fits that really well, especially at the state level, where districts are very heavily organized around castes and panchayats, local officials and so forth, and they deliver the vote. So while India looks like a big coalition system, what this conjecture suggests is that it acts as if it's a smaller coalition system than it is. Generally, such block affinities are based on clearly known social categories. In this way, blocks can reduce the commitment problem that the challenger faces. And then we had another conjecture on the next page. The challenger cannot credibly commit to keep everyone in his transition coalition. That's what Alistair was just talking about. As he learns about affinities in all of our work, the incumbent is she and the challenger is he. As he learns about affinities, he rebuilds his coalition to include the highest affinity individuals, exactly what Alistair was just talking about. Affinity allows us to capture the idea that the coalition that sweeps a new leader into office rarely is the same as the coalition that the leader uses to stay in power. We believe that alternative assumptions about how affinities are distributed can expand the generality of our theory to encompass important features of ethnic, religious, labor union, or other group politics. So what I'm going to try to build on today is these two conjectures in the logical political survival that we discussed a lot, and this is, after all, 30 years later, to figure out how we can capture that last piece of the statement that we can generalize to broader implications. So as you just saw in Alistair's presentation, while in logical political survival, challenger doesn't know affinities until the challenger comes to power. The probability of being in the winning coalition after transition is the ratio of W to S. In anticipating instability, and in a JOP article we have coming out in February, affinities are learned gradually. Leader has belief about the affinity of coalition members. So there's some probability that the affinity level is higher than a cut point. And there's a probability that L detects that a person's actual affinity is less than the cut point, in which case that person gets replaced. And so replacement occurs with this probability. And then using Bayes' rule, the probability that affinity is at least at or above the cut point, given that you've been in office for T periods, is equal to that expression. So that as affinity concentration increases over the leader's time in office, the coalition's size decreases and corruption increases. So I'm going to try to test some of this today. So that means I have to measure affinity. And I want to emphasize the in bold here. All of this coding is preliminary. This is ongoing work. And the military variable may be especially problematic. So I wouldn't want anybody to take this as the last word or the first word. It's the pre-word. It's starting to think seriously about how to estimate these things. These are not trivial problems. And trying to do it in a way that doesn't drive you to idiosyncratic country by country analysis, but rather allows you in a general way to think about the block structure of government and how that affects things. There are pieces, which I didn't have time to do for this, where the nature of the block matters. But what I'm going to focus on is simply how much you depend on blocks. There will be work that then looks at, so how much do you spend on the military if you depend on the military? How much do you spend on religious groups if you depend on religious group? How much do you spend on social groups if you depend on the social groups? And that's a complex problem. My conjecture is that if, for example, the military is the dominant element in your coalition, you pay the military less than you pay the second place affinity block, if you have one, because after all, they like you more. They're more inherently loyal, so you could save a few bucks and pay somebody else. But I'm not going to address that today. Okay, so this is a distribution of affinities or favoritism, 1900 to 2023, religious, political, social, business, and military, where I defined the variable maximum affinity as the favoritism score among affinity groups by country year, the maximum affinity score. So I've measured all of these groups, and I find whoever had the largest score, and I record what the size of that score is. Also do the same for calculating who is the second largest group, and I'm also calculating uncertainty about the affinity, who you depend on. I'm looking at the standard deviation, though I don't think I did anything with that for this presentation. And the change in maximum affinity is what it is today compared to what it was 2 years ago. And again, I reiterate, these are all preliminary codings. So we have some testable hypotheses. As the concentration of affinity in the maximum group increases, so that delta affinity measure goes up. As that increases, the coalition size decreases. That's consistent with the life cycle, but it's not because of the life cycle. It's because you have shuffled out people and you concentrated that group. You could have diversified the coalition. The longer the leader's been in office, the greater the concentration of affinity in one group, because those are the people you can count on. The higher the concentration of maximum affinity, the lower productivity, even in democratic societies. Productivity, P, the measure of the price of public goods, is going to be sensitive to the affinity score. So this creates a poverty trap incentive. If you have sufficiently high cost for public goods, low productivity, the theory tells us that your survival prospects are better if you maintain a poor society. That prosperity is bad for a leader's political survival. And the higher the concentration of maximum affinity, the greater the ratio of private goods to public goods, corruption opportunities or clientelism divided by either plus public goods provision. So that would be testing the result that Alistair was looking at in life cycles, but now based on affinities, which again, you could diversify your coalition with time. You don't have to concentrate affinities, but the time is still passing. So what do we see? Change in affinity, and in coalition size. So here I'm looking at how the coalition size changes between last year and 2 years from now. I'm doing it for all cases where there is no leader change and where there is leader change. And there's a lot of stuff here, but the thing that is of most interest is now we're looking at the change in the affinity score, delta affinity, so from this year compared to what it was 2 years ago. If I have significant, strongly significant negative coefficients. If I increase the affinity in my coalition of the top group, I shrink the coalition. These are very big coefficients. So they're very big effects. This adds nuance to the life cycle story because, as I said, I could be doing this or I could be decreasing the concentration as I stay in power longer. So what this is suggesting is that much of the unexplained variance in the life cycle effect is being driven by different directions of change in affinities. And the more uncertain I am about affinities, the more I increase coalition size and a bunch of variables. Okay. What happens to governments magnifying affinity over time? So the longer I'm in office, the more my affinity will be bigger in 2 years. And that's true controlling about productivity. And you see productivity, coalitions, bigger coalition size, smaller affinity, less favoritism in larger coalition systems. But the longer I'm in, the more I am trying to concentrate that. Affinity hampers productivity and enhances corruption. So here I'm looking at the top quartile in coalition size with no leader change. And what we see is that if affinity last year was high, productivity goes down and corruption goes up. The second place affinity guy, the bigger they are, as well, corruption goes down. Corruption goes up and productivity goes down. Hard to move variables, by the way. And that's controlling for the log of tenure, whose coefficients are much smaller. And we got whether you're chronically ill and how, all of the other stuff. Okay. So I end with these two graphs. You saw the graph earlier for coalition size and corruption. Here I've done a quadratic fit rather than a linear fit, but same basic story. The bigger the coalition, the less corruption. And here I have multiplied the size of the coalition. These are all normalized between 0 and 1, and the maximum affinity score. So what we see is as this product gets bigger from a very small size, corruption goes down, bottoms out, and it turns up. Even in democratic societies, if you organize the government around favored groups, corruption rises. You might think about that when you think about the United States at the moment. I believe that's it. Yes, I am done. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I am the first representative of the Jim Michigan PhDs. Thank you so much, Jim. It's an honor to be here to celebrate your career. I was Jim's first Zoom defense, I believe, because I finished pretty early in the summer of 2020. So it's a good time to be back at Michigan. And this is like the dissertation defense that I never had. Hopefully this is a lot better. This is joint work with Livio DiLeonardo at Bocconi and Scott Tyson at Rochester. This project is also a testament to Jim's influence because it wouldn't exist. Oh, I don't know, they were evenly spaced when I present them, but this project exists because Jim was so encouraging when I wanted to write models and work with Scott. So thank you, Jim. We are going to talk today about a project that is related to some of the themes that Bruce and Alastair brought up, which is we're going to be thinking about a specific kind of leader and how they stay in power, namely autocrats. And we're going to talk about a different tool as opposed to provision of public or private goods. We're going to talk about repression. So repression is a very common tool that autocrats rely on, either to deter the mobilization of some kind of organized resistance or to crack down when they're facing a mobilized threat. Now, this is often something that's quite concerning to outside actors like Western democracies, the United States, members of the European Union, who dislike the kind of general repressiveness in autocracies. They might be interested in taking some kind of step or using a policy that would reduce repression of the opposition, encourage more open political competition, or support the emergence of democratic institutions. Now, tools that they can use to do this include things like economic sanctions or providing conditional foreign aid, support for democracy promotion activities, but these have generally mixed empirical evidence for their effectiveness. And one of the challenges is that compared to something like direct military intervention, those kind of policies tend to play out over the longer horizon. So it's not an immediate effect. And so to understand whether or not these kind of indirect tools of influence can actually change how autocrats use repression or encourage democratization, we need to understand how autocrats use repression and how that affects opposition over time. So does repression help an autocrat by hastening the demise of the political opposition, or does it actually hurt the autocrat by creating a backlash effect, where we see an increase in mobilized resistance that can help sustain the opposition over time? If this is what's going to happen, I will warn you that there will probably be some things cut off at the bottom that I will try to address. But we'll find out if my math is as bad as Alastair's. So,
Perfect for my laptop. It was perfect when I sent it.
this also was all on screen when I sent it. We're in the long run, we're going to ask, how does repression affect autocratic stability and the consolidation of authoritarian regimes? We're going to show that repression facilitates consolidation, but the path to getting there for the autocrat might be quite bumpy. And from the perspective of foreign interference by an outside actor through these kind of indirect tools is going to generally increase the odds that an autocrat consolidates power, but not necessarily the pace of consolidation. So I'll show you later that some kinds of interference can slow down the process of consolidation. This gives the opposition more opportunities to potentially oust the autocrat, but it means that they're going to face more repression on the way. So how am I going to do this? I'm going to build a dynamic model of instability featuring an autocrat and their opposition. There's going to be two different ways that repression today can affect the probability of consolidation and eliminating the opposition tomorrow. So empirically, we don't observe a consistent pattern of whether or not repression mobilizes future opposition through backlash, or you see this kind of crackdown of dissent effect. We're going to account for both cases because we think that this might actually play out differently across different countries and over time. So we'll account for the fact that repression can hasten consolidation in autocracy or bolster the resistance. This is going to produce three different kinds of equilibrium outcomes, which you can think of as long-run patterns of contention. One where we're going to see deterrence, so there's never going to be a challenge by the opposition. One which is going to feature instability and persistent challenges. And the third that's going to be a mix of sometimes deterrence and sometimes challenges that I am not going to talk about for the sake of time, but I'm happy to talk about later. We're going to show that foreign interference generally cannot reduce repression and encourage democratization at the same time. So that's going to create a trade-off for policymakers who might want to use these kind of indirect tools between these kinds of different outcomes. This I'm going to skip over other than to just say that there are so many times that Jim is on this slide. I thought it was important to show that the Michigan representation in my influence here. So Jim and Bruce and Alastair here, they're cut off at the bottom. And this is basically CPRD. Okay. So I'm going to show you first the model. There's going to be an autocrat and opposition that interact over an infinite horizon, and in each period, we're going to have 2 stages. First, the autocrat is going to choose a level of repression, RT, and then the opposition has to decide whether they're going to challenge the autocrat. And if they choose to challenge, that's going to be xt equal to 1, and if they don't challenge, it's going to be xt equal to 0. Both players want to hold office, and if the autocrat is in office, so they start in office, they're going to get this benefit B, and if they lose power, then they're going to get 0 normalized forever. The opposition gets 0 at the start because they're not in power, but if they manage to oust the autocrat, they're going to get an office benefit G, which, just to fix ideas, we're going to think of as ushering in democratization. The important thing here is that these are different kinds of regimes, so they get different benefits, G versus B. Repression does a few different things for the autocrat. So first, it's going to be expensive. The autocrat's going to pay a cost for investing in repression capacity, C, and we're going to assume that the benefit of holding office is bigger than that cost. I'll come back to that assumption in a second. The opposition, if they decide to challenge the autocrat, suffers the cost from reactive repression. So you can think about this as the opposition has mobilized a protest in the street, then they're confronted by the autocrat's police, and the amount of damage that the police can do depends on their capacity or their weaponization, which is going to be increasing the level of investment in repression R by the autocrat. So K is going to be increasing in R. Repression also is going to affect the likelihood that the autocrat survives the challenge. So we're going to say if the opposition doesn't challenge, then the autocrat survives for sure. There's no way that they can lose power independent of a challenge. But if the opposition does challenge, then the autocrat remains in office with probability R. So the investment in repression is going to increase the likelihood that they can stay in office. With 1 minus R, the opposition kicks them out and democratizes. Finally, repression is going to affect the likelihood that the opposition is finally defeated tomorrow. So if RT means that the opposition suffers K of RT, the crackdown from the police in the street, with probability pi of RT, the opposition is completely eliminated. They cannot mobilize in the future. So maybe that means that their leadership has all been arrested. They lost all of their funding. That's going to mean that there's no longer a threat posed by the opposition to the autocrat. And with probability 1 minus pi, the opposition survives to potentially pose a threat tomorrow. Now, here is where we're going to see the impact of those different assumptions on the relationship between repression today and consolidation tomorrow. So I didn't tell you the direction of the effect of R on pi yet, because we're going to account for both cases. So first, we're going to consider the case where repression hastens consolidation of autocracy. This often gets referred to of an autocrat that's been able to facilitate like a culture of fear, where participation in opposition in a crackdown then is going to deter future dissent. In this case, repression today makes me both more likely to survive and more likely to consolidate power by eliminating the opposition. On the other hand, repression might create a backlash effect. So in some other cases, we see that an increase in repression is going to mobilize additional opposition against the autocrat, in which case, more repression today still might mean that I'm better able to survive that challenge. I can mitigate the acute threat, but I become less likely to consolidate power tomorrow. And this case is going to create an intertemporal trade-off for the autocrat in their investment in repression capacity. Okay, so mine is just as bad. So the opposition, in deciding whether or not to challenge, is going to have to trade off the cost of challenging today, which is going to depend on the cost that they suffer from engaging in or suffering from repression, with their expected future benefits, which if they succeed in taking power means that they get that office benefit G. But even if they don't succeed at taking power, they still might survive with probability 1 minus pi to get some benefits again in the future. Now, there's going to be some level of repression that makes this equal. And you might notice here that I dropped the time subscripts because we're going to solve for stationary Markov perfect equilibria. So we're just going to call those R's for now, not RTs. The level of repression that makes this equal, we're going to call the deterrence level. Because for any level of repression at or above, it's too costly for me to suffer the challenge today. I'm willing to be deterred by the autocrat, and anything below, the opposition is going to challenge. So this is going to be a function of their expected future value VZ. Just to simplify notation going forward, I'm going to call that deterrence value, so where they're going to be indifferent between challenging and not, RD. For the autocrat, the work that B greater than C assumption is doing is it means that we're never going to have voluntary abdication. So there's never going to be a case where the autocrat says, the cost of repression is too expensive, I'm willing to just hand over power to the opposition. Their consideration is going to depend on whether or not they want to choose a level of repression at the level that deters challenges, or they want to choose a level of repression that's going to accept challenges. And that's going to change their expected costs and benefits. The important thing here is not exactly what's in this equation that you can't really read. Just know that there's benefits and there's future considerations. And when you're in a lower range, so instead of being between RD and 1, you're 0 to RD, you're facing challenges, so now there's Rs multiplied by those payoffs. You might not get to survive to get those office benefits. Okay, so now we can get into equilibrium outcomes. And here, again, we're going to see that it matters quite a bit, the relationship between repression today and consolidation tomorrow. So when repression hastens consolidation, there's never a reason for the autocrat to choose a level that does not achieve deterrence, because repression here is only gains. Higher repression today means that I can avoid the possibility of a challenge, and it means that I'm better able to defeat the opposition and consolidate my hold on power. But that means that the interesting question is, how big is repression instead? So does the autocrat just choose the minimum amount that they need to deter a challenge, or do they go above and beyond and invest even more heavily in repression? And that's going to depend on exactly how repression today translates into defeating the opposition tomorrow, or formally, how steep is that pi function? So when pi is pretty flat, and so repression today means that I'm a little bit more likely, but not much, to consolidate, then I'm just going to choose that minimum level and I'm going to achieve deterrence. So that means that I'm not going to face a challenge, and eventually I'll consolidate. But as pi gets steeper, so repression today means that it's actually more likely that I'll be able to consolidate tomorrow, then I'm going to invest even more heavily in repression, potentially all the way up to 1. So when pi is really steep, I'll max out repression. We can see a similar deterrence when pi is decreasing, or we see a backlash where repression bolsters resistance, but we're also going to get some pretty different outcomes here. So in this case, deterrence is only going to be at that minimum level. So we're never going to see exceeding that RD, because now a higher level of repression means that I'm extending the number of periods until I'm likely to consolidate. So anything above RD isn't changing anything for me in terms of my survival today, but it is extending my horizon where I have to deter the opposition. In this case, we might also see a very different kind of outcome, where the autocrat is going to deliberately choose a level of repression that invites challenges. So even when deterrence is feasible, so they can avoid any possibility of losing power, they still might want to invite an opposition challenge, because at a lower level of repression that invites challenges, as long as it doesn't do too much to harm my chances of survival today, it's going to increase the likelihood that I can eventually defeat the opposition and consolidate my hold on power tomorrow. Now, which of those two things is going to hold is going to depend on the relative costs and benefits. So we're going to see two kinds of pure strategy equilibria in the world of pi decreasing. The first is the deterrence equilibrium, where you choose that minimum level RD and there are no challenges. The second is an instability equilibrium, where you choose an RI that's below RD and you face a persistent challenge in every period that the opposition is still operational. You're not going to be able to see that, but what that is an equation that tells you the relative costs and benefits that's going to pin down which of those two things is optimal for the autocrat. So just to sum up the equilibrium outcomes, when pi is increasing, so repression helps me consolidate power, we're only going to have a deterrence equilibrium, and then the only question is just how fast do we consolidate. When pi is decreasing and repression bolsters resistance, we have deterrence as well as instability, and a mixed strategy that I'm again not going to talk about. What? please ask me about it. Please ask Scott about it in Q&A. So now that we have our equilibrium outcomes, we can understand what repression is doing for the autocrat in the long run, which is going to set up how we can think about foreign interference. So the first thing we can characterize is how long does the autocrat rely on repression? So how long does it take an autocrat to consolidate their hold on power? Well, that depends on a few different ways that the autocrat can exit this path to unconsolidated autocracy. The first is going to be they might lose power by democratization. So that's going to mean if they lose power today, they've only had to rely on repression for one period, but it didn't do so hot for them. They can also consolidate, in which case they're relying on repression for one period, but they've successfully survived a potential challenge and managed to consolidate their hold on power. If neither of those two things happen, then they have to continue to rely on repression for another day. And so one of the things that would be here otherwise is a sum that tells you how long in expectation you would have to rely on repression before you're going to be able to exit this kind of competition between the autocrat and the opposition. Now, what happens in equilibrium depends on whether or not we are in a deterrence equilibrium or an instability equilibrium, and it depends on the relationship between repression and consolidation. So I'm going to start in the instability equilibrium because that's one's pretty straightforward. When you're facing challenges, an increase in the level of repression capacity today, so Ri, is going to increase the duration of repression. Because an increase in Ri means that I'm more likely to survive today's challenge, so I'm not going to exit via that democratization path. But instability equilibria only exist in the world in which pi is decreasing. So that means that more repression today, I survive, but I extend the horizon that I have to rely on repression to eventually eliminate the opposition. In a deterrence equilibrium, when pi is decreasing, an increase in RD is going to do the same thing, right? So it's going to mean that I'm investing in more repression, I'm secure, but it's going to mean that I have to rely on repression for longer. When repression is hastening consolidation, so pi is increasing, an increase in the level of the deterrence RD is then going to reduce the amount of time that I have to rely on repression because I'm increasing my probability of consolidation as I increase repression. We can see a similar thing when we think about how much repression does the autocrat invest in before they can consolidate power. And so this one actually is a little bit easier to see. So it's going to depend on the probability they survive, which is mu, the chance that they don't consolidate power, which is 1 minus pi, and their investment in repression per period, which is r. And we're going to see the same comparative static effects. So we're going to see that this is going to increase with Ri because I'm extending the horizon and how much I do every period. Similarly with Rd, when we see that repression is bolstering resistance, and when it's increasing consolidation, we're going to see that total investment in repression goes down. We can also use this to think about the kinds of outcomes that a foreign actor might be interested in. So for example, what's the probability of democratization? Now, in a deterrence equilibrium, there is no challenge. So the probability of democratization is always 0. In an instability equilibrium, the probability of democratization is going to be decreasing in Ri. Because as I increase Ri, I'm more likely to survive the challenge, so the probability of democratization is going down. We can do a similar exercise, but I don't have a slide for the amount of repression that's actually incurred by the opposition. But I can capture that with this kind of summing up the comparison between deterrence and instability, so challenges and no challenges. In a deterrence equilibrium, there's going to be no repression actually incurred by the opposition because they're never going to take to the streets. So we're going to see a strictly lower level of reactive repression. We're going to see a strictly higher probability of autocratic survival because, again, no challenges. And we're going to see a strictly lower probability of regime change because, again, no way to oust the autocrat. How long is going to take the autocrat to consolidate power in comparison between deterrence and instability is going to depend on that pi function. We can take this to think about, if we go back to our motivation, what can foreign interference of the kind that's short of direct military intervention actually hope to achieve? We're going to be thinking about 2 different kinds of objectives of an outside actor. The first is going to be to empower the opposition. So you can think about this as the kind of investments either in conditional aid, like I promise you that I will invest in your country if you oust the leader, or in like something like democracy promotion. What this is going to do for us formally is it's going to increase the benefit G that the opposition gets when they take power. You could also think about an outside actor that's concerned with directly trying to reduce repression and by punishing the autocrat. So that is going to reduce either their benefit of office or increase their cost of repression. The easiest to think about here is economic sanctions. So what's that going to do? It's going to depend first on whether or not we're in a deterrence equilibrium or an instability equilibrium. And even within those categories, it's going to depend on whether or not repression is hastening consolidation or bolstering resistance. So we're going to start by thinking about the case of empowering the opposition. So what's the effect of doing something like promising conditional aid? In a deterrence equilibrium, it's not going to have any effect on either the probability of democratization or the cost of reactive repression incurred by the opposition, because we're still in a deterrence equilibrium. That's still zero. But it is going to change the amount of repression that the autocrat has to invest in, because what providing some kind of empowerment to the opposition is doing is it makes them harder to deter. So for the autocrat, they now have to increase their investment today in repression, because that's what makes the expected cost of going out to the street for the opposition so expensive that they're willing to be deterred instead of trying to get that now higher office benefit. When the autocrat increases per period repression, that's also going to increase long-term repression. So more repression today, I'm going to have to increase my total amount of repression for longer. But it's not going to have a direct necessarily increase on the duration of repression. And this is where that difference in how repression affects in the long run does come to bite. So if I increase per period repression, and that's hastening my consolidation, then an investment by a foreign actor in trying to empower the opposition actually hastens the consolidation of autocracy by incentivizing more repression by the autocrat. If instead repression serves to bolster the opposition, then we're going to see that this increases the duration of repression. So I'm going to have to do more repression that reduces my probability of consolidation, and I have to continue to rely on repression for longer. If we think about the instability equilibrium, that's the case where there are opposition challenges. This would be a case where you might think empowering the opposition should actually have some effect. It turns out that it has no effect at all, because the opposition is already willing to take on the challenge. So making the benefit of them taking office higher, that's just an added bonus for an opposition that was already doing the thing that could benefit the foreign actor's interests. So we're going to see no effect of that kind of intervention on anything in an instability equilibrium. If we go to what does the punishing an autocrat do, so this is going to be those economic sanctions, we're going to see that it doesn't do anything in a deterrence equilibrium, because the autocrat is still going to be willing to choose a high enough level of investment in repression capacity to achieve deterrence. And so we're going to see no cost of reactive repression, no probability of democratization, and no effect on the amount of repression. This does matter in the case of an instability equilibrium where the opposition is willing to challenge. So now, by making it more costly for the autocrat to use repression, they're going to want to decrease the amount of repression that they use. So an increase in that cost, I'm willing to now take a slightly higher risk of losing office in order to not have to pay the extra expense of that higher level of repression. That marginal trade-off is worth it for the autocrat. That's going to be the direct reduction in per period repression. Challenges only exist in the world in which repression bolsters resistance. So it's only going to exist in the world that pi is decreasing. And so that means that when you reduce per period repression, you're actually going to reduce long-term repression, because it means that I have less repression every day, and reduce the duration of repression. That's going to come through two different effects. One, by reducing the amount of repression, it means that the opposition is more likely to succeed in their challenge. So we could see total reliance on repression go down because the autocrat's getting defeated more. But at the same time, every time that they survive the challenge at a lower investment in repression, they are now more likely to consolidate power. So it means that if I survive, I'm more likely to successfully defeat the opposition at that slightly lower level of repression. This is why it's an ambiguous effect on the probability of democratization. The opposition has a higher chance in every chance that they take to unseat the autocrat, but the duration effect means that they have fewer chances. So we might actually see a decrease in the probability of democratization because the autocrat is able to consolidate too fast before the autocrat can kick them out of power. Now, there is sort of a silver lining to this from the foreign actor's perspective, which is that it does reduce the cost of repression. So the opposition here is challenging in every period, and it means that they are constantly incurring that cost of reactive repression, like meeting police on the streets. And when repression is lower, that cost just goes down from the opposition's perspective. So just to sum up, we show that autocrats come to rely on repression to secure their hold in power. But the relationship between how repression affects dissent in the long run matters for the autocrat's long-run ability to consolidate power and how many challenges they take on the way. Sometimes the autocrat will strategically invite challenges even when repressing at a level that achieves deterrence is feasible, because it gives them an opportunity to confront the opposition where if they can survive that challenge, they're able to wipe them out and defeat them and consolidate their hold on power. Outside interference is going to affect an autocrat's ability to consolidate power differently depending on this long-term relationship between repression and consolidation. And so where outside interference can have an effect that aligns with this actor's interests is going to depend not only on whether or not you are in a deterrence or an instability equilibrium, but also on that relationship. So we might think that it would be pretty easy to observe whether or not there are challenges, right? So we should know how to tailor our policies just to whether or not the opposition is willing to challenge the autocrat in the first place. That only gets us so far. It also depends on whether or not when you don't see challenges, if this intervention can potentially hasten consolidation or support the resistance. Now, before I wrap up, I know I'm like close. Yeah, no, it's okay. I think I said it. Before I close, I think I have like a couple more minutes. I do want to close with a quick story about Jim. When I was trying to write my dissertation prospectus, I went to Jim and I asked him for an example that was, in addition to the logic of political survival, of a book that relied so heavily and integrally on models. And Jim went to his bookshelf and he pulled for me Economic Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy by Acemoglu and Robinson. Great book. I took one very important lesson from this meeting, which is that I wrote a 3-paper dissertation. I probably should have learned a second lesson from this meeting, which is that things start to get really complicated really quickly when you work with this kind of dynamic model, which is why those 2 books are both more than 500 pages. We clearly have not learned that lesson yet, which is why our appendix is more than 30 pages. And so for me in the long run, what this means is that I might be a little slow, but eventually I might have learned all the lessons that Jim had intended to teach me over the course of my career eventually. Thank you so much, Jim, and that influence will persist long into the future.
I just want to apologize to you guys. I don't know what happened with the slides. We're going to try to get it fixed at the break for the second group. I apologize to you, Scott, and Jessica. Just, yeah, right. I hope you got the gist of it anyway. We'll make the slides available afterwards for those that want to check the math. Because anyway, questions. Let's have questions for a little bit of time. And for the people who are answering the questions, you might have to turn around to answer. Is that okay with you? Stand up or move your chair. A lot of work. Okay, Sarah. Yeah, fire away.
Yeah, I know this really the first 2, but I think the third one speaks to it too. That I'm kind of chill about the whole situation, as we call it in DC, the evolving federal landscape that we're facing. And so I see on social media political scientists talking about current state of affairs and this piece of the world are like, this is bad. We're like checking every box in the autocratic playbook. You guys have written about, dictator handbooks, we have Americanists who are like, not good, but you guys seem like way more chill about this. And so I wanted to kind of get like a bumper sticker version or like a takeaway point that if like a reporter or say an undergraduate student were asking you. You can't even hear any conclusions, but like that what makes you so calm, about, because you both mentioned it, so I thought that was just really telling and it was a lot about.
Slide. If you can.
So, I would like a layman's interpretation, like you would say to a reporter. So I feel like that's
Well,
what,
he looks at a nice picture.
okay,
The simple elevator is not enough people will benefit the United States more honest for that effort. Whereas in the smaller coalition, you can make people better off in the coalition. I'm not talking about most of us, but people support from. The coalition is sufficiently small. You can say, or any, but here, past here, you can only make the coalition better off by 80%. That's the take. He can't survive doing this. Because it would be too much for by normal corporations. There's the picture.
So we actually, it turns out, this is something we had done the sort of maths for this, like when we did the logical political survival. And none of us actually thought to take a partial derivative with respect to the price of public goods. And then we realized actually, I mean, turns out it's all from the second derivative. But it's just this shape of this curve really steep. So if you can produce public goods very cheaply, which I'm going to say we can in the United States with a very dynamic modern economy, so we can make some. And you're a very large coalition, this gets very steep. And the proportion of government spending on private goods relative to public goods is very small. And so we've just drawn the welfare here in the coalition, but if you drew the welfare for the people outside of the coalition, right over here, you're in North Korea, this North Korea is here on productivity, and you're outside the coalition, your welfare is right there. But if you're in South Korea, which is up here, and you're outside the coalition, your welfare is here. You're not getting the benefits, but your life is not too badly ruined by having, less spent. Most of us have not suffered enormous economic losses one way or the other, changing regime. And so the basic point is, if I was to draw in the welfare of those outside the coalition, it's closer and closer to this line as I get higher productivity and as I get larger coalitions. So the sort of calculation to make is, would I sooner live in a less accountable regime being in the coalition, or would I be better off to be out of the coalition, but have a more accountable system that's going to produce public goods anyway? And the key is, once we get very steep, do the trade-off, I'm actually better off being a loser in an accountable system than being a winner in a less accountable system. So that's the sort of calculation. It's better to have Biden, if you're a Trumpist, you're better off having Biden and not getting the sort of private policies that you like, than it would be to have your guy less accountable. That's
Private policy, for example, tax laws. Yeah. Bill, you have a question?
Yes, I do. I want to follow up on that. That's something that Bruce mentioned before. And I buy that's why it's not going to pay to gradually move them in. But maybe that's not what we're talking about, right? What if a couple of years from now the election is about to happen and it doesn't happen? And Trump thinks his winning coalition is a small set of industrial elites and the military. And so we're defective with the fact of jumping from where we are down to this other point.
So we have another picture, which unfortunately I didn't bring, but I can emulate. So if you're here and moving to here, the size coalition, you see, even if you're in the coalition, you're worse off. So even the guys in the coalition, when the slope is steep enough, as it is in the West, even the guys in the coalition would make it tiny, the few who survive the purge. And an expectation, that's a very risky thing to agree to. Even if you assume you're gonna survive, you're worse off. That's what else is in here. You're actually, and so in anticipation of being worse off, when you see the pressure to move to that, you push back. And we hope theory and data align. I can only say, the only countries in 200 years of data that stopped being this country were countries defeated by Nazi Germany. And when the Nazis were overthrown, they returned to the large.
What explains why members of this coalition are not objecting to actions that seem to be pushing them?
Yes, right. If I could put this purely in analytic terms, taking personal opinion and emotion out, Trump is doing exactly what any leader would like to. He's trying to shrink his winning coalition. That's almost good for me. The problem, and we begin to see pushback, is that as he makes that effort, enough people are harmed by it, people who back him. He loses support. So we now see 40% of the public. Over 90% is a big chunk of his inner of his coalition. We see even more some of his other policies. So on the healthcare policy, 87 in the Republican Party, it's 60 something. So what we're seeing is he is facing that pushback, people maybe not smart enough to anticipate the consequences and back off or face the massive. Let's hope trends.
Okay, Listen, I have a question that may be silly because I'm not a political scientist. Why is the assumption that everybody works as a rational actor acting in their best own interests? It seems like when I look around at people as a whole, the average person is irrational.
I have never seen, other than schizophrenics in very young children, I have not found anybody who potentially acts against their will. That's what we assume. Rationality only assumes that people do what they believe is in their best interest. They may be wrong. It may turn out badly. Why do we assume that? Well, if we assume that some people act in their interest and some people don't, I'm going to borrow from one of my son's slides at the University of Chicago. You will be very disappointed in your analysis. There's an awful lot of people behave as if they're trying to do what's good for themselves. And the empirics suggest that, of course, we're not explaining 100%, but we're explaining the wrong. Father has a favorite phrase, I am confused. You know what I am. It means it can't be that way. So the set of I am genuinely hard pressed to think of anybody in a position of authority who actively acts against the Richter side. One of my more obnoxious books. I have a section about Mother Teresa. So I will shut up in a moment by posing a question. other than a personal family, friend, or relative. Not a cartoon character, a real person. Can anybody name a nun other than Mother Teresa? Not somebody who's your teacher, or can you name a nun other than Mother Teresa?
Sister Jean, she died yesterday.
Oh, well, okay. So you saw something. Mother Teresa was very careful to brand herself. She violated all of the charitable giving conditions that Maimonides articulated hundreds of years earlier. You should give anonymously in the sense that the recipient doesn't know who gave. She made sure they. You should give anonymously in the sense that you don't know to whom you are giving, but she made sure. And you should give so that the recipients will not need further assistance from you. She didn't do that. By contrast, gave sub-quality healthcare and education. Sorry, to come up, Teresa. She was a rational actor who branded and attracted a lot of money and so forth to her movement and to herself. I can't say Mother Teresa was not rational. There are people who throw themselves on hand grenades and warfare, and they don't become leaders, and we don't.
I'll give you one example.
Morrow is bidding 1 million.
Sorry?
Morrow is bidding 1 million. Not what
We know that ex post. We didn't know that ex ante.
no, very happens.
Well,
It was done for guilt.
so that's not irrational. Utility function is not just money.
Did you hear that when he said, there's Merkel admitting 1 million immigrants in Germany was not, you're saying ex ante.
Yes, he's saying ex ante.
You're saying ex post.
Saying ex post was not, that utility functions are not one dimensional.
Guilt isn't a rational, doesn't mean rational. Right. Okay, other questions, we have time for a couple more questions. Jim?
So, Bruce, let me give you a different. What's going on?
This was the I'm confused.
So, slavery is very powerful, very prolonged. It also assumes what four parts of moments. One of those things that assumes how the trunk smells, which is the division of power. You know, but in this life, so in this life, the leader gets that's the policy.
Okay, so the point is that selector theory assumes away key parts of the problem. That's the nature of any theory. One of those is division of power. That in the model, the leader can just simply set policy whatever they want it to be. The way I like to put about this is, in BDM squared S squared land where we live, accountability is everything. Division of power is nothing. If you go to Sibelius land, George can't be here today because he's off in Rochester getting the Riker Prize. Division of power is everything. Accountability doesn't matter at all. One way to say what's going on now is that Trump's policies are designed to destroy the division of power in the government, because that's one of the ways we help produce public goods in the long run. Is by dividing power, it creates greater stability in policy. It prevents more actors from doing different things. And what he's interested in doing is consolidating power and ending division of power, because then he can start producing private benefits, which is how he thinks he's going to hold on to power.
So we can think in selector theory terms about blocks. States are blocks. So we can think of federalism as organized around blocks. And we can think, instead of the leader, we can think about the leadership. And that includes so we can finesse it. Yes, the nature of theory, as you certainly know, at least as well as I know, is to simplify reality, not to produce all of the details of reality. That's the objective.
Last question. We have three speakers for the afternoon, the second part. We have Heron Joe. She's an associate professor of political science at Texas A&M. She does research and teaching in international relations, special focus on international institutions and international law. Her book, Compliant Rebels, won the Chadwick Alder Award, and she has published in numerous journals. Has been funded by many foundations, including the Alexander Humboldt Foundation, the National Science Foundation, Howard Buffett Foundation, and the Carnegie Corporation. Our second speaker is Jason Davis. He's an assistant professor in political science at the Political Science Department at Florida State. His background and much of his work is in international trade, but he's been increasingly working on topics related to conflict and security, interstate war, sanctions, and even cybersecurity. Uses formal theory to explore topics in all of these domains. Misses many things about what? Yeah. Well, Rob Francis isn't here, so okay.
Left out the part about how I don't understand any of these.
Oh well, I wasn't gonna.
Figure that out in a minute.
Yeah.
Context in which this bio was going to be used.
All right. Sorry. All right. Okay. Someday he may try to do empirical modeling to make Rob Francis proud, but he will need to reinstall R. You don't use R, I guess. And may need to reread some of your notes. You miss many things about Ann Arbor, especially the dog, but not the weather. Okay. Sarah Elizabeth Croco, professor of government and politics and a faculty associate at the Center for International Development, Conflict Management at the University of Maryland. Also director of the Honors Global Challenges and Solutions Living Learning Program. That's a lot of words.
It's called H-Glow.
H-Glow, okay. In the Maryland Honors College. All three of them received their PhD from Michigan. I should have mentioned those for the other two. Research interests include international conflict and when and which citizens assign leaders responsibility for international wars, value of policy consistency in elections and territorial disputes and civilian targeting. Work has appeared in numerous journals and won numerous teaching awards. We'll same rules as for the first three. We'll try to keep time and have Q&A. And then at the end, the big treat for all of us after the three treats is Jim will say some words. Okay. All right. There you go. Yeah.
Okay, my presentation will be a little different. So I thought we have a lot of smart people in the room, so I'm going to keep the presentation short and open up for Q&A at half of the time. And when I was asked to speak here, I'm very honored, by the way, to be here. I was thinking, okay, what should I present? And I've chosen to present a very, very new work, which I just started. It's about alignment. And alignment here is defined as proximity of one country to the other, economically, politically, and security-wise. And I'm going to learn a lot, and I was learning a lot from Jim's work on offensive. He wrote numerous articles, arms versus allies, and asymmetric alliances. Why do we have alliance treaties? So I'm going to learn something from there, and I'm going to have a little bit of reflection on Jim's scholarship in taking my intellectual journey. So his book, Order Within Anarchy, Eric Posner at Chicago Law said the best book on laws of war empirically and theoretically. It deals with 20th century laws of war, every state behavior. And we learn a lot about conduct on high seas and treatment of prisoners of war, treatment of civilians, aerial bombardment, various dimensions of laws of war behaviors. But the central thing we learn here is laws function as focal point. So it fosters reciprocity among states, and that's how laws will work and operate. And that is the primary motivator and driver of compliance and non-compliance in laws of war in the 20th century. So when I was working on this project with Jim by reading a lot of histories and helping his codes for this data set, I was thinking, okay, we don't have a lot of interstate wars among and between states nowadays. So that was, I was taking back to 2000, long time ago. And I was thinking, okay, how would that operate in civil conflicts that we usually see? And that was the time we didn't see a lot of interstate wars, but we saw a lot of civil wars. So I was questioning myself, okay, what about the laws of war and civil conflict? And started questioning, well, why would rebel groups in civil wars comply with the law? What would motivate them to exercise restraint? And that became compliant rebels. And the focal point idea is also the basis of my book, because rebel groups, some of them get to learn about international law principles. And here is a picture where rebel groups attend International Red Committee of the Red Cross training, and they learn the preferences of democratic sponsors, for example, about laws of war. And that is one of the motivator for them to comply with laws of war. So one book on interstate, the other book on intrastate. So it is directly coming from Jim's work that I built on for civil conflicts. So that was my first journey. And the project I'm going to talk about, the title is Small State, Statecraft and Realignment. And here, small state refers to non-major powers. So if we think there are about 200 countries in the world and leaving out major powers, about 10 of them, then that leaves us about 190 countries. So it covers a lot of countries than conventional definition of small island nations, which covers only 60 countries. And I'm interested in characterizing the global order after the Cold War and how alignment and realignment happens. And it's funded by Carnegie Corporation of New York. And the motivation comes from this event in 1895 when Queen Min was assassinated. And Queen Min was the queen of Korea, Joseon dynasty at that time. And it was the time this queen was trying to align with Russia. And her father-in-law, and here conflict with in-laws are universal. So father-in-law, King Gojong, was trying to align with Qing dynasty, China. And there was large contingent of bureaucrats that were trying to align with Japan. And some contingent of elites were trying to align with the US because they thought US was emerging power at that time in the region. So 4 coalitions were forming, and that event, assassination of Queen Min by Japanese factions, that defined the future course of Korea. And most of us know what happened after. So Japan annexed Korea in 1910. And this was kind of precursor of that coming. So this kind of pattern of domestic coalition forming for certain alignment with foreign powers is not just Korea's story. There were a lot of historical accounts here and there. I was reading about small states that are following this kind of pattern, domestic factions fighting over what kind of foreign influence they should have. And this is actually coming from reading a lot of histories together with Jim. There was one summer we met almost every day. We were reading and quoting what happened during World War I, World War II. And that was one of the things that I learned over the summer, how to read histories and take lessons from those histories. So this is the map we live in. This is a snapshot of 2020. So some of the alignment might be different. And I called A scores for short for alignment scores that I developed in this project. So we collect about 15 variables, security related variables, political alignment related variables, and economic variables like FDI, trade, and for political variables, how countries vote together at the UN General Assembly, how they have diplomatic recognition by having embassies. And for security related variables, we look at defense cooperation agreement and joint exercises. And together, we built, the project team builds latent variable, which we call A score for alignment score. And we do that for this part of the map just for US and China. So every country has A score with the US and China. And we get this map by mapping some of the countries that are highly aligned with the US. And that's blue countries that you can see. And we map some of the countries that are highly aligned with China, and we see those countries here in the map. And gray countries are the ones that we can't really say that are highly aligned. So when I say highly, we have some threshold in the measure that defines these gray, blue, and red. And you can also change the threshold, but this is one threshold we chose. And gray countries are the ones that are not either highly aligned with the US or China. And again, this is 2020 map. So I would love to see after 5 or 10 years whether Canada's color would change or not. But this is very different from the Cold War map that we can have in the Cold War. We have communist countries, Soviet aligned countries, and US aligned countries, and some of the about 50 non-aligned. But this is a very, very different map that we have. And the scores are coming from gradation. So unlike alliance, which is a binary variable, alignment measurement is a continuous variable. So you can see shades of very blue or not very blue. Again, Canada, I mean, we have to see in 5-10 years how that changes. But China is a little bit blue because it has a lot of economic activities with the US, for example. But Africa, it's very light blue. And you saw a lot of ally countries that are blue here. An A score with China again, you see a lot of red, mostly because of the economic activities. And Bruce, you mentioned India, and India is very interesting. It's very red because of a lot of economic ties. And when you do the Bayesian latent variable, the loading of economic variable is very high. So that is one of the things that is driving this measure. And you saw a lot of gray countries and what's happening there. And we saw a sample of 10 Southeast Asian countries here. And if you look at Indonesia, for example, the green line is the economic tilt toward China. So above 0, you can see that those countries are tilted economically toward China. So almost all of the Southeast Asian countries, there's tilt toward China economically. Security, which is red line, that's a little bit different story. So if you look at Indonesia, so the lower bottom would be closer to US. So security-wise, that's a very different picture than the economic landscape in South Korea. So we come back to Jim's work. So how can we think about these hedgers? And his article on alliances and asymmetry provides one answer or one angle to this problem of hedgers, understanding hedgers. So in this article, he suggested one of the central feature of asymmetric alliances, military alliances, is the trade-off between autonomy and security. So I'm from South Korea, so when South Korea wants security or security umbrella from the United States, that's the benefit that South Korea can get. But South Korea might have to give something. So it might have to allow the US to use their bases, and that's one of the autonomy laws that they might have to suffer through if they want security umbrella from the US. They might have to give up command control ability a little bit in order to invite the US to exercise their influence in the region. So those are calculations that are really core and central for alliances that are asymmetric. And the small state statecraft captures that element too, that small states have to really think about what they lose and what they get when they align with superpowers. So again, when we think autonomy very broadly about keeping sovereignty and having your own decision, then we can plot out some of the economy A scores, so alignment scores based on FDI, trade, and aid. Then you will see a lot of countries are aligning with China, and that's a very different picture if you see the security related alignment scores where many countries still want to maintain security alliance with the US. So the deeper question is, why do you see alignment and why do countries sometimes realign? So we come back to this historical incident as a motivator. And I enjoyed presentations a lot this morning, and we come back to this wonderful framework. To me, it's a framework usually because I'm not a modeler, and I usually think of it as a framework and to think about domestic coalitions. And we could think of a winning coalition and its electorate on the superpower side, great power side, and we could also think about winning coalition and electorate on the smaller powers, and then how they would interact with each other. And the idea about blocks, idea about affinity, how some of the private goods or public goods generated by these alignments or realignments could affect the formation of blocks or the movement of blocks and how that might change affinity might give me some ideas in the future how to build theories on this. I just started with this project and just plotting out some patterns. So I would very much appreciate your views or your questions about empirical measures. So journey will continue, I think. So I read a lot of Jim's work here and there still in my seminars with my graduate students and in my own work. And Jim always has this Homer Simpson voice and, you know, why do you think those two kids were? I can't really say it, but he does.
Do you think that's the case?
This movement line, like I don't know, like how the hand movements. And I've learned how to join important debates, and laws of war idea was directly coming from the discussion with Jim, so I really appreciate that. And again, what we learn from history and cases is also important. I thought of him as just a game theorist, but while reading history here at ISR every day, I learned how to really get important questions and how to think theoretically from those cases. Thank you.
Yeah, why don't we, for 5 minutes, if you have
5
questions
minutes.
for.
Yeah.
So you have sort of security alliance and alignment with bundle of security and economy and you like I was curious what you have there. Do you have geographic distance there or do you have like cultural proximity or anything other than the variable and how you merge them together?
So I don't have cultural proximity variable. So I have 3 bundles in this alignment indicators. So one is political alignment indicators. So UN voting and embassies and shared IGOs, for example. And then I have economic alignment variable, which is composed alignment set, which is composed of FDI, trade volume, and aid. And then I have also security related variable, defense cooperation agreement, defense alliance agreement, and some of the joint exercises that I could get. So I have 3 bundles now at this point.
So if you wanted to, if you ran a regression, gravity model of trade, Signorino and Ritter's S measure or my tau B measure or a new measure in Social Science Quarterly by Suk-Won Lee, how well would just those few variables do at predicting the alignments? Do you have any idea?
So I didn't bring that. My student is doing that, your tau B measure and S score. We found significant difference.
You want to do that and the gravity model? Gravity
model we didn't run yet.
If the 2 seem to me will produce your results, not one by itself.
Okay. Okay.
The model will give you the trade aspect of your picture, and S or tau B or whatever should give you the security piece.
Yeah. So conceptually, S score and tau B and UN voting are a little bit different from alignment measure I bring in. So I think for other people who would use, if they are focusing on alliance or security dimension, probably tau B might be better. If they are focusing on some of the political alignment, then UN voting might be better. If they are interested in some of the bundles of alignment behaviors, then that this would be better. So I think conceptual differences are there if I have to compare them.
Yeah, I could go. I think one thing about the commercial exchange piece is that it seems like in some periods of history, it's very politicized. And who you trade with is a good indicator of who you're politically aligned with in the international system. And in other periods, it seems almost disconnected, unrelated, like the post-Cold War era. Globalization flourishes, and trade patterns seem to be much less related to geopolitical alignment. And so maybe part of it is a reaction that you're sort of, the measure is struggling with those periods when the foreign investment and international trade are less politicized. And so maybe you want to focus more on the security side indicators of alignment, take out the economic side, but maybe it's also a puzzle too about when does the commercial exchange get politicized and when it less politicized.
Well, actually, that would be the reverse of what I was thinking. So the alliance literature, actually, they are using the word alignment a lot. So when we see the literature on alignment, most of them were mentioning alliance. So when the literature talks about bandwagoning or balancing, it was mostly on military alliances for World War I, World War II, and a little bit of Cold War era. And then now with the globalization, I don't think it would be possible to understand alignment, the positioning of countries without understanding economic interdependence. So I agree with you that security and economic interdependence, the weight of it is different. The relationship might be different depending on the era. But I think in order to understand what's going on with respect to countries' positioning nowadays in the contemporary era, I don't think it would be possible without understanding some of the economic dimensions. And hedging behavior is like stemming from those.
More questions about
Sure.
it after. Okay, Jason, thanks.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I got it. All right. Let's work this clips. Okay. Doesn't sound like is it being amplified? Okay, great. That's the best of all worlds where I can't even tell is being amplified. Perfect. So I am going to eventually present some of my own work, but not until after 15 to 18 minutes of nonsense. All right. So the first part of my talk is titled, "Is there a broader, deeper trade-off in Morrow?"
No, I'm always shallow.
Let me say, it is great to be back at University of Michigan. It is great to be here in Ann Arbor. I see a lot of people who I recognize. None of you have aged a day. It looks great. Great to see you. Happy to be here. Breadth versus depth. All right. Most of us can hope to achieve less than or equal to one of these. There are obvious trade-offs between allocating your time to a wide variety of areas and trying to focus on one or two. This is true in research and probably in life. I'm here as your life coach here. Can we observe this trade-off in Jim Morrow? This is my thesis statement for part one of my project. Well, let's start off by trying to do sort of an existence proof here of depth, right? So one indicator of a very deep contribution is when your work shapes people's thinking without people being aware of their source, right? Where people start talking about it and starts, shaping the way they analyze different events, and they don't even know why. So it's like some examples, you can think of comparative advantage, Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage. People eventually start to lose the Ricardo part and just thinking about comparative advantage. And in political science, we have some great examples. We have tit for tat, we have audience cost, we have veto players. Do we see this in some of Jim's work? Well, obviously, unfortunately, there's going to be some spillover compliments on some other people here in the audience, right? But if you haven't read The Logic of Political Survival, unfortunately, you missed Prime Big Deals Day when you could have gotten it at a discount. Logic of Political Survival, one of my
stories about this. I was at a development economics conference, political economy and development. And there was one economist, he came up to me and he said, oh, you had mentioned selector theory in your presentation. I would love to learn more about it. What should I read about it? I'm like, well, you should just read The Logic of Political Survival. He's like, oh, I hadn't heard about that particular book. And I'm like, what world did we end up in that you were aware of the idea of selector theory and wanted to learn more and hadn't heard of Logic of Political Survival? But going beyond that, and so I have another story about this particular video that's on YouTube, The Rules for Rulers. It has tens of millions of views. I was in China with my friend who's a lawyer, has like never taken a political science class, and he's talking to someone else, and he starts talking about this YouTube video that was explaining how autocrats behave and what they needed in order to stay, to stay in political power. And I'm like, wait, what is this YouTube video, The Rules for Rulers? It turns out that this is a video that is about selectorate theory. I believe that, like, talk to like Bruce and Alistair in constructing this video. This video is so extraordinarily popular that it generated on YouTube a parody version of the video. It has generated a series of reaction videos, Rules for Rulers. Again, this is just about selectorate theory. And then remarkably, there was a reaction to the reaction video that then showed up on YouTube. This is now, I think, the most prominent way in which people have learned about selectorate theory. I don't know why you keep writing these books. I see people talking about it, like people just throw out selectorate theories. Like, oh, we got selectorate theory in action and this kind of problem. I went on Reddit and I found people talking about, well, how much do you think that selectorate theory describes politics? This ended up in sort of the sociology section where they said, I saw this video on Rules for Rulers and it's now just shaping the way that I think about politics. How can I possibly learn more about this? I think selectorate theory is one of those things that have just like started to shape the way that a wide variety of people think about the world in ways that they are no longer crediting you. And I think that is a real demonstration of depth. So having established depth, right? We also know that Jim has written a lot of papers on a lot of different topics. I've definitely skimmed this book. One could have made a successful career on just selectorate theory, but Jim decided to sort of move in a different direction. This got to the point where it became a meme at this conference that Scott and Jess were at, the Swarm Laws of Conflict conference, where people kept talking about, oh, there was a Jim Morrow paper about this. I think, Scott, you started making the joke of like, well, there's a Jim Morrow paper about it.
I think Mark Fay made a couple of points funnier than Mark Fay.
Yeah, that's right.
It into a joke.
I appreciate that you were there in order to do that. There's a lot of stuff he's worked on. It's covered in a lot of different areas. Is any of this good? Clearly, anyone could write something on I could, especially chat GPT these days, you could write a lot on a lot of different topics. As sort of an example, I want to talk a little bit about Jim's work in the space of international trade, because when people think about Jim Morrow, people are sort of recognize that he wrote some papers about trade. I haven't seen Jim all that often at IPES, right? So there's a little bit of a question, should we bring him to IPES? People, I don't think, characterize Jim as an international trade scholar. So let's take a look a little bit at some of this work and then decide for ourselves if any of it is any good. Specifically, I'm going to talk about this paper, How Could Trade Affect Conflict? So I think to this day, the sort of the dominant way in which people think about the interaction between trade and conflict is, okay, two countries, they start trading more, that increases the cost of going to war. And so as a consequence, it's going to make them less likely to go to war. In this paper, published in JPR in 1999, Jim makes the point that, so at the same time, I think sort of our dominant framework for thinking about the onset of conflict is basically the bargaining model. And Jim's paper in 1999 basically notes, when you increase international trade, yes, you are making it more costly for a possible attacking state. And so you are decreasing the resolve of that state, but you're also decreasing the resolve of sort of a potential target state and making them more likely to make concessions. So if you sort of bring this idea that trade is increasing these costs into a bargaining framework, you end up in a world in which the effect on the likelihood of conflict is indeterminate, right? I think to this day, this is still one of the clearest statements of this issue in terms of thinking about the intersection between trade and conflict. It's on my graduate IPE syllabus. And so I think this is just like a really nice paper in the space of international political economy. It sort of demonstrates that even in these domains that Jim isn't exactly Jim's focus of attention, we're getting some really good work and some really work that could be foundationally interesting. So let me talk a little bit about mentorship and teaching, right? depth. We got some great presenters, not me, but like other presenters here who are showing that he's had a very long and lasting and very effective mentorship and effect on their careers, on their lives. There are lots of people who couldn't be in this room, but you can see that you can think about many of these possible examples. Let me think about one possible example of Brett, which might not have come up since, because I never actually taught. I never TA'd for Jim's intro IR class. You would sometimes complain to me where you're like, oh, Jason, you don't know any of my fun stories about Singapore because you were TAing for my IR class. But I did TA for his advanced game theory class for ICPSR. And I think this is sort of an interesting class because for people, this was they were coming from departments which didn't necessarily have serious game theory sequences. For a lot of people, this was their first serious introduction to game theory and its applications in political science, and they would come from all of these different places in order to get those applications. So some famous people who have taken his ICPSR class over the many years until his children graduated and he stopped needing the money to do it are Jim Furon, right? Jim Morrow unfortunately keeps telling people, well, I can't tell people that any of my graduate students were the best graduate student that I ever met because I knew Jim Furon when he was a graduate student. It's like, okay, you don't need to tell me that, Jim. Right? Jim Furon came and took his ICPSR game theory class. Another sort of, prominent figure in the world who took Jim's ICPSR class, and I'm not sure he would even know this, is BBC Dad. So while I was TAing for him, BBC Dad came, and at the time I was calling him Robert, not BBC Dad. Right? He's a scholar in South Korea, and he came to learn more about game theory. I think he even sort of presented something, and it didn't quite make sense, but it was fine. A long, illustrious list. So I actually went through my old grading notes from the 2 years that I TA'd for him. And I just went through people who I met. I probably missed some of people who took this ICPSR game theory class and are still in the profession in jobs. And I found 10 people in tenure track jobs over just 2 years of this. And I probably, missed several of them. And several of these people too talk about how oh, I'm really interested in formal theory. I'm really interested in game theory. I'm really interested in using this work. A lot of these people, I think, possibly even some of them, I think I remember reading that they published papers that they started working on in your class. I think this is a really interesting demonstration where you probably didn't even know who's taking your ICPSR class, but they came and talked to you and they learned sort of a way of thinking about game theory. And I think you see that demonstration of breadth in that context. So it's Jim, okay, he's accomplished a bunch of ththings. It would be much nicer if he were just sort of a workaholic who was kind of annoying and, very narrow-minded and spent all his time doing that. You really want, when someone's really successful, you want to learn that that's all that they are. And so is that the case of Jim Morrow? Unfortunately not, right? He would always make pulled pork for, some of these graduation events. This is paella, as I recall. Thank you, Karen. I'm stealing stuff from us. We're Facebook friends. You know about Armagnac. Now you're going to go off to Sonoma and get back into wine tasting and things like that. You would always invite people, graduate students, over for Thanksgiving. So this was sort of a copy of the email from that. I thought that was always a really nice thing to do and talk about bringing a dish that reminds you of home. So Jim Morrow, as you might expect, does not have a Facebook account. But Jim Morrow was nonetheless able to troll me on election night 2020 through Karen. You probably wouldn't remember this, where I posted this, and Karen says, not a Magnum, Jim Morrow. I said, only because I've transitioned to the stronger stuff. And so then we have Jim says you can go back to Canada.
Wait, so you have a Facebook account?
No.
I have one right now.
So with all that said, so what is Jim not good? Writing long, sentimental emails, right? I had this, I'm a talker, right? You can imagine, I would write Jim these emails where I'd be like, oh, I got all these thoughts on things. Here's a job I might apply for. There's all these different things. It doesn't really seem like a fit, but it's got this thing. And Jim would say things like, sure, why not? So I actually went, I went back through the archives and I found the actual email where I asked him to co-chair my dissertation. So I said, we had a brief discussion about this a year ago. I recommend selecting your committee's chair by third year or earlier. So if you're comfortable with it, I'll follow the request with the department. Jim responds with, Yes, fine with me. Start of a long and beautiful relationship. So I got a couple things to say about this joke. I had recently watched the Stratford, Ontario production of Annie, the musical. It's still ongoing. You're only 3.5 hours away from Stratford, so if you live in Ann Arbor, it's a good production. You can go and see it. And I was in. So bet your bottom dollar that tomorrow's will not come up tomorrow. Okay, I think that's a great joke. But the way that this joke came to me, it's just like another Jim Morrow, won't come up tomorrow, is I woke up, I was asleep and I woke up and I was like, this is gold. So I went and I wrote down this joke. It's just like, you ever see that Seinfeld episode, right? I wrote down this joke and I'm like, that's going to be great. I'm going to use that in the presentation. I went back to sleep. I woke up and I read it and I'm like, this is still gold. This is a great joke. I can't wait to use this. I then ran it by several focus groups, right? I ran it by my graduate IPE group. I ran it by several other of the junior faculty at Florida State University. They all hated the joke. They all told me, do not use this joke. This joke doesn't make any sense. I refused, right, to comply, and the joke is still here. Bet your bottom dollar that tomorrow's will not come out tomorrow. We will not have another Jim Morrow anytime soon. It is sad that he is retiring, but I'm sure he'll have a fun time in California. Okay, awkward transition slide. So the paper that I'm going to talk to you about, having been on this nonsense for a while, is called Clandestine Sabotage, joint work with Yellen and Rupel. All of my work is to some extent influenced by Jim's sort of way of thinking about papers. Is this the paper of mine that's most influenced by Jim? No. Is it the paper that I'm presenting at Peace Science? Sure. So let me tell you a story about a particular case called Stuxnet, which is something that I've been learning a little bit about. So Stuxnet was this virus, right, that basically a cyber attack that was launched by the United States and Israel. The attack began in 2007. It was an attack basically on Iran's centrifuges that they were using as part of their nuclear program. For the first 3 years, this attack was totally undetected. It destroyed a limited number of centrifuges in a way that was designed to look like user error. And then in 2010, it was unexpectedly discovered by security experts in Belarus, computer security experts, after the worm inadvertently spread outside Iran's nuclear facility. So it was never intended to leave Iran's nuclear facility. Someone sort of plugged it in somewhere and it ended up spreading throughout different kinds of networks. And eventually this Belarus security team that was not looking for it happened to find this weird worm. And they're like, okay, let's figure out some stuff about this. And they ended up tracing it to Iran and eventually it became public. So this was an attack that, in fact, they even had code in the virus that was designed to disable itself after a certain period of time so that people would basically not discover. And so it's trying to create this damage without being detected and without even being sort of observed as an attack. So how did it work? It closed exit valves on random centrifuges so the gas would just sort of get trapped and would build up. This eventually caused damage and wasted gas. The overall direct effect, because I think sometimes when people talk about this, they think about the damage that it did, was actually pretty limited, right? Like it didn't set the Iranian nuclear program back by a lot, but it did create this sort of confusion about what was going on in a way that people weren't really attributing to sort of external intervention. And so when you talk to people who are involved with the program, they basically say the idea was to try to disrupt operations that could lead to a nuclear program and to make their scientists feel less secure and less capable of doing their work, right? The intent was that the failures would make them feel like they were stupid, which is what happened. Okay? The use of the cyber weapon malware designed to infiltrate and damage systems run by computers was supposed to make the Iranians think that their engineers were incapable of running an enrichment facility. And the response to this was that they overreacted. They fired engineers. It really seems from the reporting that we've been able to get on the Iranian regime that they started to think like, maybe we can't do this, right? Maybe our engineers are not as capable at producing this outcome because all these problems keep happening and we don't really know why. So this case, I bring to you to inspire a model with a couple of different features, right? Specifically, a sanctioning state, the sanctioning part is not super important, but ends up in the model, tries to get an adversary to abandon some program for which success is uncertain. They have the option of landing at clandestine. So my cybersecurity friends tell me clandestine means that it's both covert and it's sort of not observed. It's not detected. So it's not just that it's covert. It's like people don't really know that it in fact has happened. The clandestine cyber attack, and I'm going to call it a cyber attack, but it doesn't actually need to be a cyber attack per se. The key features of it is that it's going to cause no direct physical damage, but it's going to distort a signal that is received by the recipient about their likelihood of success. The receiving state is then going to observe the signal of their likelihood of success, not knowing if it's being distorted. And the question that the paper asks is, can this kind of attack induce behavior changes in the receiving state? What implications does it have for questions of attribution and deterrence? So it's motivated by Stuxnet. It's not a paper that's just about Stuxnet. I'll have some other examples, but even I don't know anything about these things. That was in my bio. But like my understanding is that there were even sort of intelligence operations in sort of the Soviet era where there were attempts to make like pipelines and bridges look like they had collapsed because of like natural reasons and things like that, or random error. And I think this model could be helpful in providing insight to those kinds of intelligence operations, even as I think that this kind of the structure may become more prominent as cybersecurity becomes a bigger part of the international relations landscape. So what do you get? Under certain conditions, clandestine sabotage, as I've described it, can be pivotal in getting the receiving state to abandon a policy goal. If the receiving state knows or highly suspects that you are capable of sabotage, but you do not attempt sabotage, so you don't try to do this, but they think that you're able to do this and would have an interest in doing so, then you're worse off than you did not have those capabilities, and the receiving state knew that. And so this creates incentives to try to keep whatever capabilities you have to do this kind of attack secret. And then if they're revealed, you end up in this worst case scenario where you have to use these attacks anyways because people are expecting it, but you end up in a world that is no better for you than if you did not have those capabilities. So what do we already know about some of these topics? What kind of work exists out there? I don't want to have huge literature review. So we have another Buena de Mosquita, on the slides here is a cool paper about imperfect deterrence with imperfect attribution. This paper by Borgard and Lonergan was talking about coercion in cyberspace and basically saying that it's tricky because of a lack of attribution, and that like sometimes in order to coerce, you need people to sort of know that you're trying to coerce them and know what they need to sort of like what they need to acquiesce on. Michael Joseph at UCSD has a paper about coercion without attribution, where people just do pattern recognition, where like they're eventually like, well, if I do this, something horrible is going to happen, even if it's not attributed, so maybe I don't do that. This paper sort of adds to that by talking about a way in which something that is clandestine can sort of help to influence action by basically complementing direct coercion by reducing the expected value of pushing back on that coercion. So I'll give you a little bit of an idea of what the model looks like. State A is trying to influence people and your program. They can launch sanctions and or a cyber attack. Here, sanctions, the only important point is there has to be some kind of cost that they can avoid by acquiescing. In this model, it's sanctions, but it could be that they just even have some kind of cost to try to receive the program. State B observes those sanctions and a signal about their program, and then they choose to acquiesce or not, and then sanctions are not imposed if they end up acquiescing. So state A has high or low probabilities, low capability in cyber of engaging in this kind of clandestine attack. State B has capabilities in pursuing a particular program that are just distributed continuously on 0 to 1, so that the capability between 0 to 1 is just their probability, their underlying probability of success in pursuing this program. And the way that the distortion is going to come in is it's basically just going to divide out that they're going to receive a signal about their capabilities. If no attack is launched on them, they're just going to get like the true probability of success. But if a clandestine attack is launched against them, that's going to be divided by this gamma term, where the gamma represents sort of the effectiveness of this clandestine sabotage, such that they then observe a signal of their success, which is lower than their actual probability of success. So their expected utility of rejecting the demands and continuing to pursue the program, underlying this conditional on B, is just that probability of success times the value of that. Is that coming through right? And then if they acquiesce, it's just sort of normalized to 0, right? And so the probability of success conditional on observing a signal is, it's this chance that things are not being distorted and the chance that they are being distorted, and they have to take both of these things into account when making a decision. So their expected utility kind of rejecting the demands to sort of give up this program is that total probability times the value minus the cost of sanctions that they then endure by having to reject it, which creates a cutoff value for the signal, above which they decide not to. They decide to reject the demands. One of the propositions here: a perfect Bayesian Nash equilibrium exists with both high and low types of state A threatening sanctions. That's the important part. But only high types launch cyber attacks, and then state B acquiesces whenever their theta that they draw is below this threshold. The advantage of the cyber attack is that it generates some additional added acquiescence, and also under these circumstances when they acquiesce, they have reduced use of these sanctions, which are costly for the opposing state as well. So there's sort of two benefits in terms of like probabilistically that they are generating by launching this cyber attack. Second proposition is relative to not having this, it leads to a higher probability of acquiescence, a higher probability of these demands being accepted, right? And so, yeah, this is just sort of comparing the sort of underlying probability of success to the signal, the probability that's sort of generated in this environment where there's some possibility of a clandestine attack being created. And then sort of the last part, and this is the one sort of comparative static result, is that as the other state knows that you're capable of this, you're just sort of uniformly worse off as someone who's considering using these kind of clandestine attacks. And in fact, as the probability that you don't have these capabilities goes to zero, the probability that they acquiesce essentially converges, but you end up in a world where you have to use these attacks. Everyone knows that you're using these attacks. They adapt their expectations. It doesn't produce you any benefits. But then if you stopped using it, they'd be like, well, I must be really great. And then they really won't acquiesce, right? So some examples, right? In the Stuxnet case, the Stuxnet virus then got observed, right, which was never supposed to happen. So we might think that the universe of this case is mostly as things that we can't observe. Following up on this, you had Iranian lawmakers who basically, every time there was sort of a power outage in the Natanz, they're like, oh, this might be sabotaging an infiltration, right? This seems very suspicious that the power went out once or twice or all these other circumstances. What's going on here? They've clearly adapted their expectations, having known that this kind of attack is possible and has been used in the past by the adversaries who are attempting to get them to abandon their nuclear program. You also see that some of the same people who are involved in that attack have started talking about left-of-launch operations that are designed to basically disrupt North Korean missiles, right? And basically use cyber technology to try to disrupt their navigations and things like that. Quote, last year, the North conducted 8 flight tests, only 1 succeeded, a missile, an overall failure rate of 88%. It was after the last failure that North Korean leader Kim Jong-un was reported to have ordered an investigation into whether the United States was sabotaging the country's test flights, right? So there's an actual discussion of a potential program. It's adjusted the way that even the North Koreans are thinking about their likelihood of success. And I think that adjusts their willingness to sort of abandon this program and the way that it affects their impressions. In the Iranian case, this stuff was happening. They didn't know why it was happening. They fired a bunch of engineers. I'm sure they're doing great. And the North Korean case, right? He's basically, after all of this failure, right? He's just, there are pictures of him having like cigarettes with these different scientists. If you think that what's happening is sabotage, that doesn't mean that you are going to feel the same way. That leads you to a different feeling towards the engineers who are hopefully pursuing your particular program, right? Okay, so what's the paper summarize? Paper presented a model which sabotage distorts an adversary's understanding of their likelihood of success, and the attack is not observed directly. This can work, but it really works less well when adversaries know that it's possible. So there's sort of a nascent literature in cybersecurity talking about cyber deterrence and maybe like cyber institutions to try to deter people from attacking you because they know that you could respond even if they don't observe it. This is sort of a mechanism that pushes in the opposite direction, where if you want to distort people's understanding of their own capabilities, you want them not to know that you have these capabilities. And at some point, you end up in a world where we're going to observe all of this distortions and things like that going on out in the universe, such that it's not really serving any strategic advantage, but you have to do it because everyone knows that you can do it. Everyone knows that you have an interest in doing it. And thus, if you don't do it, then they're going to be even more active in pursuing these things that you don't want them to pursue.
What was the code that was sent to your phone?
You choose.
Let's see. Okay, if anybody gets hold of Jim's phone.
You didn't even have a cell phone.
And if you want to send me a no, I got photos, don't worry.
Ken, where's this? Oh, cool. Okay, awesome. Okay, so Jason, when you mentioned the
long, heartfelt emails. I actually looked it up. When I got promoted to full, I emailed Jim. And hey, I got promoted to full. I'm so happy. Dear Sarah, congratulations! Exclamation point. Yes. So I knew I was like print it out and frame it. I'm like, those exclamation points are rare. And so I was like, cool. Okay. Thank you. So I'm going to do my presentation a little bit differently. There are no equations. So we don't have to worry about that. So for two reasons. One, I thought about Jim a lot when writing this. His academic accomplishments are well known. I'm sure he has an absolutely absurd citation count. So many books, so many famous articles. And so I thought, if I were Jim, what I would like is someone to talk about a different side of me that maybe people who only were graduate students or who taught with him would know about, and kind of the influence that he's had on so many people, even beyond or who aren't in academia. I also have the privilege of being very close, live very close to several people who I went to graduate school with. We live we're miles apart. And so when I said I was doing this, I got a lot of feedback from these people who had many contributions to share. I talked to a lot of people from grad school regularly, and they were so excited. So this is a group project, and that a lot of people contributed to this. I'll point them out. Okay, so here we go. Oh, I always have to have an outline slide, otherwise I get lost. So I'm going to talk about Jim's early years, what it was like teaching with Jim. I got to teach with Jim several times in the 160 class. He was my co-chair, so I want to talk about how he works with graduate students, and then end with Jim's influence on my own work. And we'll see where it goes. Okay, so Jim's early days at Michigan. So Jim and I actually came to Michigan, or Jim came back to Michigan at the same time in the year 2000. So I was at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And that's where I'd been first introduced to political science by Bear Bromler. I took his class my junior year. I was actually like a film major when I took that class as a gen ed requirement. And I just loved his international war class. And I would go to his office hours all the time. And one time I said to him, I really wish political science could be a job. And he looked at me and he's like, what do you think my job is? And I was like, oh, I didn't think this was like a thing. I thought that you were just like a teacher. He's like, who do you think writes all this stuff? And I was like, oh, okay. So then he's like, okay, you're going to graduate school. And I think more pointedly, he said, and you're going to Michigan. And so that's how I ended up here. But Jim was coming from Hoover, and what the rumor on the street was that he wanted to work with graduate students. And that was a big reason for why he came back. He was also a part of a big shift in the IR field where they were looking to add senior faculty. And so this was a big deal that Jim was coming to Michigan. Of course, this was before, the internet was still young back in these days. And so there weren't a lot of pictures. Obviously, he's still not on Facebook, right? So there's not a lot to know about Jim before actually meeting him. And so I just had to go on his reputation. And so I knew badass game theorists, right? This is all the professors at Illinois were telling me. And I just heard from everybody there, that guy is wicked smart. And so this was my thought about what Jim might be like before actually meeting him, because I had no idea what he said, right? I had very little idea what it meant to be a political scientist, much less a game theorist. And so I was like, okay, guy who likes math and writing equations a lot. This sounds good. This is Jim in real life. So no, you didn't notice why these particular pictures are so badass game theorist. Absolutely true, without a doubt. But also, and I just want to share, there are a few snippets here. Jim and I both love Star Wars. I forget how this even came up that we discovered our shared love of these movies. And I should say the original three. We don't talk about the other ones. We have had several friendly yet heated discussions, I would say, about Ewoks in particular. When we'd be walking to class together, Jim had very strong opinions about Ewoks. Somehow I did too. And so we would fight about whether Ewoks were actually valuable, whether they served any purpose in the Battle of Endor. Argue that, yes, of course they did. They tripped the walkers, everything. Yes. Then moved on to another series, Harry Potter. Now, keep in mind, this was way back in the day, so these books were just coming out. And I remember Jim, of course, huge fan. And we would have, again, friendly yet heated discussions on our way to lecture, largely about the role and the nature of Snape. And I remember Jim just so into this. You would turn on your heel and looked at me pointedly and you said, you can't be a double agent and kill the president, Sarah, talking about Snape. Because I was pro Snape before all the books came out. And then finally, the Diet Coke. So when I I can't even express when I talk to people about doing this talk, they're like, you got to talk about the Diet Coke. You got to talk. And I'm so glad Heron brought it up. The hand gesture, this. So, and the Diet Coke also reminded me, and I didn't put this on the slide of things I learned from Jim, but I should have, is that a covered desk, and I do mean covered in papers, books, stacks of papers around the desk, such that you have to like mince your way through to get to the chair. Also, Diet Coke cans full and empty. That was Jim's office. That is very similar to how my office looks now. A colleague walked in who hadn't been in my office for some reason recently. They were just like, what is this? And I probably said, I learned from the best. I'll let you. So, yes, cluttered desk, brilliant mind. Jim in talks. So I just, again, this also came up frequently when I was talking to my friends about what they remember about Jim. He could ask questions in a talk that would get right to the heart. It was either a job talk or just someone else's presentation of that issue that seemed to come to him so quickly. And it would take a while for the rest of us to kind of catch up and be like, oh yeah, that is really cool insight. Okay, nice. Clearly loves politics. He comes through not only in his knowledge of history, but also just having a really intuitive sense about how politics work. And that would just come out so clearly in his questions when he would ask them talk. A commanding knowledge of multiple literatures, even those outside of IR, which was impossible. But this one here, and I had a hard time really capturing this. And I was talking to my friend Joel Simmons, for those of you who don't. We would often watch Jim in talks, and he could somehow draw on this massive base of knowledge in his head. And so I'm not actually sure if talking about sugar prices in Peru in the 1930s was something Jim actually said, but this is akin to the kind of comments that Jim would make in talks, where he would have somehow deep knowledge about seemingly obscure topic that he could talk about then, and the person presenting is like, how in God's name does this person know this? But Jim did. And so Joel and I would always say like, oh, sugar prices in Peru, when that was our signal. When Jim would make one of these comments in talks that he had no business knowing anything about sugar prices in Peru. But okay, teaching with Jim. So I taught 160 with Jim many, many times. And so Jim kind of, especially like graduate students, has kind of this serious demeanor because he is badass game theorist. But you could tell that he really enjoyed getting students excited and that he loved teaching 160. Talking with a friend of mine who really does a lot of pedagogy, who did a lot of teaching with Jim. She's like, he was one of the few people who I taught with who clearly engaged in all the best practices. This is Leanne Pounder. So she was always very impressed by your teaching, and she's taken a lot from you. Just two particular that I'll talk about. One, and I think somebody said, hey, Jim, stand on the table. I don't know if that's referencing this, but this was a legendary thing that Jim would do, where he would stand on the table in front of the lecture hall and pretend to be an American bomber. And he would jump off the table with a big boom. And when he was reenacting the Battle of Midway and how the...
He wants to do that. It's retired. It's retired.
Okay. Well, this thing's on. So people who were in touch with their undergrads from Michigan who were in your class and they're still in touch today, they still remember this, right? When you say Dr. Morrow or Professor Morrow, they're like, oh yeah, that guy who jumped off the table. But they always remember how the Battle of Midway ended up because of that. Then this one is that I remember clearly in Lorch Hall, the big lecture hall, which I've heard has now since been dismantled, but walking up and down the lecture halls, or the aisles of the lecture hall, and then seeing students, of course, this is old school, doing the crossword on an actual newspaper. And Jim would ahead of time prepare a few clue answers in his head. And so he would lean over and be like, 6 down, chimpanzee. And it was just, everybody in the lecture hall was like, oh my God. And it always got a laugh. And he's like, yeah, I just put it beforehand. He's like, I just look up one of the answers. It's not that hard. But that always made a big impression on students. Really modeled for me the importance of being kind and compassionate to students, especially in difficult times. One time that really stands out to me, this was in Lorch again. There were about 10 minutes to go in a final exam. And this was, December. Because it was so far into the exam that the TAs were actually already out in the hallway because we were starting to like gather the blue books. And this woman came up sobbing and she had overslept. And one of us ran down and got Jim because he was in the front of the room. And he came up out of the room and he said, go watch the test, so we went in. And well, some of us went out. I watched him talk to her and calm her down and assure her that she could still take the exam, that it was going to be okay. And I've been teaching a long time now, and I have seen professors who did not act that kindly, who said that the student would get a 0 case. But Jim saw that, no, that's not the appropriate thing to do. And he was very kind to that person. I can see that clear as day as if it was yesterday. I also remember in one of our TA meetings, we'd have these weekly meetings with him about 160, and the TAs, myself included, were making this nitpicky rubric that was, so hard-nosed, and we just wanted to write it with the intent of like failing all these students. And he was like, guys, we're not teaching engineers. He was like, they're not gonna go build bridges. He's like, I'd rather they enjoy this and learn something rather than you guys just trying to like nitpick them. I'm like, oh, so I've also taken that with me. That it's better to want them to learn than to be kind of, harassed while they're trying to learn. This is one of my favorite stories. So when we were teaching the BDM book, which we taught many times, student, for some reason, either there were citations in the text or for some reason they looked at the bibliography and they said, a student came up to me and they're like, J.D. Morrow. They're like, is that from Professor Morrow? I was like, yeah. I was like, because it was like, see what it is. And the student was genuinely flabbergasted and said, because they realized like, oh, this guy's a rock star. And they said, what is he doing? Wasting his time teaching us? And and I was like, no, all those people in the bibliography are someone's professor. I'm like, this is how this works. But they were just like, I can't believe, they wanted to like have you sign the book. They were so awe-inspired that you were the guy in the index. Now, these stories, I feel like these are quintessential to any Jim story. I don't know if he had a knack or he just was unlucky enough to have these 2 cases in particular come under his teaching. So Jim always had people bring the blue books, right? And I don't know about you all, but I've gone back to blue books because I can't stand all the cheating. But this, you can cheat with blue books, but you can't be stupid. So you had to bring 2 blue books because Jim always had a set of short answers and then a long essay. And this student brought 3. And in that third it was full of crib notes outlining every chapter of the book. Very well done set of crib notes. The only problem is the kid turned in that. He turned in the short answers and his cheat sheet. When Jim, I will never forget getting this, and he was just like, oh, this is going to be fun, right? Because calling that student in, there's no way out of that, right? You just show them the blue book, and it's like, yeah, you have a 0. This one, we had a student, and he was in my section, so this hit home for me, who totally bombed the final, like didn't even write something that was coherent. Somehow got a B+ overall in the class and was outraged. And he threatened to sue the department, specifically me, for getting this horrific grade. He went so far as to get affidavits like signed, and they were like the most stupid thing, like, I was in Jim Morrow's class, Sarah Croco was my TA, like that's what they said. He had like an uncle who was a lawyer who was writing all these emails about how we're going to take legal action against the entire University of Michigan. And he wanted to go after me. And so as a graduate student, I had never encountered this before. I was genuinely like, is this a big deal? I don't want to be sued. And Jim's like, yes. And Jim, I think at one point the dean had written, because this kind of escalated, we talked to general counsel and just to make sure we were covering all bases. And general counsel, I should say, was very amused by this, and they were like, please do over a B+. Let's do this. But Jim had to write an email to a dean of LSNA probably, and I remember him writing this email in the strongest terms, defending me as a TA, defending the procedure that we had used for this exam, enumerating many reasons why the student was just off their rocker. And that meant so much to me because that was really scary for me. That whole, like, I had never seen this kind of truly insane behavior, which, by the way, got diffused by none other than Lily Cavisto, who many old timers here might remember her. he just happened to walk into the office and she started talking to him and he said, well, yeah, I'm here about my B. And she said, oh, well, that's a fantastic grade. He's like, most people don't get B's. And he just went away. So, but the fact that Jim wrote this email and was ready to go to the mat for me over this, and that every TA knew that he had our backs, and that really meant a lot. Jim working with graduate students. So, like many, I really spun my wheels with the dissertation, went through multiple topics. I think the topic that I actually ended up doing and later wrote a book about, I never even had an actual defense because it was just like, yeah, whatever, just go do that. That's fine. That sounds good. Because we've been through, the defense thing already. And I wanted to know why Democratic leaders stay in unpopular wars. And I hate to use the word inspired in this context, but it was inspired by George W. Bush in Iraq. And I was teaching a summer class, and this must have been about 2 years into the Iraq War. And we were reading Democracies at War. That's one of my favorite books. And a student raised his hand and said, I don't think George Bush has read this book. And that works. Now, that joke works, but I don't work with my students anymore. They're like, who's George W. Bush? But I was like, it's funny because he doesn't really strike people as a reader. But anyway, what I thought was, George Bush is not following this. The declining advantage of democracy. But I started digging through other books, and I was happened to be reading the biography of Truman at the time. And I'm like, oh, he also stayed in Korea, despite like a 23% approval rating. And so I thought, maybe there's something here. Maybe it's not always the case that when they're facing rising costs, the Democratic leaders will back down and cut their losses. And so this also built on other theories related to like Goldman's gambling for resurrection, bargaining theory, obviously. And so I thought maybe there's something here. So in the dissertation writing process, I would often go to Jim's office and talk to him. And Jim has this knack for, I can say 20 seconds of what I've been working on, and then he can give 30-minute answer as to what I should do that is full of all kinds of interesting implications, just slicing, again, right to the heart of what is important about somebody's question and how they can move forward in a productive way, which I find is a real talent. It's not something I'm working on with my own graduate students, but Jim is so good at just knowing this is the important thing, stay on that. His natural curiosity makes him a remarkable advisor who could make people feel better about their puzzle, right? Because he could see the bigger picture and he could see how it fit in to the larger discipline. And I always left Jim's office with my head buzzing and more excited and feeling good about my project, which is not something that all of my graduate school colleagues could say with, because sometimes it's hard. Sometimes it's like, oh man, but Jim always made me feel better about what I was doing. So this is from Leanne and Michelle Allendorfer. They wanted me to make sure I hit on this, that you're always so generous with your time, even with students who are not aiming to go on the academic market. I knew when I first got here, I was like, I want to go be a research professor at an R1 school. Like, that's my goal, right? And that's all I ever wanted to do. Other people were like, not like, they're like, no, I don't want to do that. But I really like political science. I need to write this dissertation because a PhD is what I need to do what I want to do. And so these are some quotes from that. I never felt like I was a waste of his time. He was on so many committees, and yet he somehow made every student feel valued. And then really ahead of his time in terms of recognizing that a PhD could take people in a variety of directions and that all these directions were important. So I just really wanted to hit home that they value that so much and are so grateful to you. So especially this is with also Leanne and Michelle, but his footprint, this is a quote from Leanne, that his footprint is in a bunch of places you wouldn't expect to find it, specifically in pedagogy, in trying to make intro classes better, in trying to convey key aspects of research design to undergraduates. So he let Leanne and Michelle do an experiment in 160 about active learning. This led to one of the most cited pieces in international studies perspectives and is one of like the core active learning resources today. Worked to build a C-tool site with all the 160 materials because he realized his TAs were producing all these great documents, right? He's like, let's like actually save those and do something valuable so other people can use it. The things in bags activity, which he also didn't have to, but he gave time in class to support Leanne developing this kind of teaching tool about how to develop research questions, how to investigate hypotheses, right? That is still used by many scholars today. And so Jim really enabled a lot of contributions that he never asked for any credit for, that were not kind of like the big game theory book or Logic of Political Survival, but that meant a lot to a lot of people, even out, outside that realm. So these are just some random bits of advice, but they really do stick with me. One, I remember he said, write every day. I try to do this. I don't always fail, but I noticed that when I am good at that, life is much better when you write every day. Never punch down. I remember telling me about somebody who knew who got really stepped on at a conference by a professor, and they were feeling really down. And Jim's like, he had that face, and I'm like, what? He's like, I just hate when people step on bugs. And I was like, is the grad student the bug in this situation? He's like, no, I mean, don't punch down. He's like, there's no honor in that. There's no use to that. He's like, I hate it when I see people being mean to other people like that. He's like, and so I've always kept that in mind. Never go out of your way to make someone else feel. I'd like to think that he says this advice to everybody. It's not just me. Write sentences that are many, many lines long. But I remember him very distinctly sitting in his office saying, Sarah, this is dramatic language. Think grunts, think short monosyllabic sentences. And I was like, okay. So whenever I write a sentence and it's getting on that 5 or 6 line, like, okay, Jim would say, cut this back. And then this one, which is kind of just a little thing, but this really changed my writing a lot. I remember I sent him something and I must have had a lot of sentences in there that were like, I think, or I believe. And he's like, cut that out. He's like, you sound like a wuss. He's like, no, just state it. He's like, and this makes, every time I do this, I think of Jim. Jim's influence on my own work. So things I think about more because of Jim. So I'm not a game theorist. So I don't have any equations or anything where I'm like, oh, I'm drawing on Jim's work here and, adding this term. But here's the things that whenever I'm doing a new paper, thinking about a new project, I attribute this to Jim in the way that I just think about how the political world works. So this is, 2-level game. But when I talked about this with Jim in my dissertation context, thinking about how, in my case, a political leader is trying to balance not only the war abroad, but what people are perceiving her to be doing back home. This is, of course, Logic of Political Survival, right? But this has really made me think not so much about the winning coalition stuff, which obviously is important, but even that leaders will do whatever they have to do to stay in power. And so this informs a lot of my work on looking why leaders flip-flop, why leaders lie, things like that. So yes, citizens might not be smart, right? I'll come back to this another slide, but they still respond to things that leaders do, and their responses have consequences, right? So everybody likes to assume that Americans especially are very dumb and don't know anything about politics. He's like, yeah, but they vote, right? So we have to care at least somewhat. And then finally, and most importantly, never assume the conventional wisdom is automatically right. I remember when I went into Jim's office and I was like, hey, I want to do this thing that totally challenges the idea of declining advantages of democracy. And I think that's wrong. And I think it's actually hinging on the fact that they're not looking at which leader ended the war versus which started it. He's like, go for it. Run with it. Not saying, oh, I don't know, those guys are pretty smart. What do you think you're doing? He's like, no. Right? And that turned into my first solo piece, The Decider's Dilemma. Again, another Bush reference, but and then I like to say my first book. It's also my only book. More of an article person. But my book here that also challenges that and says that, hey, Democratic leaders are not these benevolent people who care about what their publics want, right? They want to stay in power. They want to maximize their own political capital. Sometimes that means ignoring the public and staying in the war. My favorite quote, which I think is probably in both these pieces, is somebody asked Bush kind of early in the war in Iraq, do you ever think about leaving? And he said, because the reporter added, because your popularity is really starting to dip and people are mad. And Bush turned to them and said, we're not leaving, even if Laura and Barney are the only ones who support me. And Laura is his wife and Barney was his dog. And I was like, that is the least democratic thing a leader could say. But he said that. And so that kind of inspired this book. So once 2016 rolled around, I realized that the real train wreck was in American politics, and I wasn't going to let all my Americanist colleagues have all the fun. So now I do a lot of work with Americanists. So here we are looking at flip-flops, which actually, again, also started in the Iraq War. And through many papers I've done, this is challenging the conventional wisdom that being called a flip-flopper is like a political death knell. Not at all, in fact. People don't care if you flip-flop, as long as you flip to the side that they're interested in. Here another one about talking about lies. We thought that people would just assume, the conventional wisdom would assume that people think all politicians are liars. And so if you tell them they're lying, they're like, yeah, no big deal. We turned out that you can actually make people care if politicians lie and reward them for lying. Another one, this was again, inspired is kind of not the right word here, but how during the family separation crisis, how the press secretary and the Trump White House said, oh, well, we can't do anything. It's totally up to Congress. Congress has to pass a law. Otherwise, we're going to keep taking kids away from their parents. But he had the Department of Homeland Security person come to the podium instead of himself. And so we thought, oh, hey, maybe it's true that executives can use people who work for them as shields to protect their own impression on the public. We found out that, yeah, this works. And so we had some fun with that. This is one of my favorite papers that I've ever written with Mike Hamner, also a Michigan alum, who some of you in the room probably know. He's one of my treasured colleagues at Maryland. So way back in the day when I started at Maryland in 2008, I would make a habit of going to the American Politics Workshop, and I would always present a paper there every year. And I'm sure they were like, why is this IR woman coming to talk to us? But they were great fun. And so the paper was about audience costs, and I was talking about this. And they were kind of looking at each other weird as I was giving the presentation. And when I was done, they said, is this a real thing? This audience cost? Like, really? And I'm like, yeah, it's like a key thing in IR. Like, this is like a major theory. And they're like, do you think people even know who the president is? Much less are they watching him and like tracking his every word? And I was like, hey, this is what we think. So Mike Hamner came up to me afterwards. He's like, let's look at that, because he's an Americanist. So he and I formed with one of our graduate students, I think, this really fun partnership where we investigated what is driving this result, right? Because hopefully political science has found that there is this audience cost effect. But we found that that completely vanishes when you don't use hypotheticals and when you don't ask about how they handled the situation, right? That the entire result falls on those two things. And once you take that away, care. Okay, so to end on a happy note. So way back in December of 2008, this was Jim's, so this is in the winter, so a lot of us had defended over the summer, and so we were going to come back and do the walk across the stage in the December ceremony. So me and several of Jim's other recent students were going to walk. Jim and Karen threw a lovely party at their house and invited all the students and their families, and my parents were so touched by this gesture. My mom still talks about it, that they never thought they would ever meet any of the professors who I worked with at Michigan, much less be invited to their house. And they just were kind of just like, I can't believe this is so cool that they're doing this. And I remember Karen pulled me aside at the party and said, Jim ordered for the first time his regalia, the Rochester regalia, because he was so excited that he was going to get to hood his first set of graduate students. I remember you telling me that. And so at the hooding ceremony, I think it was in the basketball arena. And I remember, like, it's kind of this weird thing. I guess every school does it differently, but at Michigan, there's kind of like this corral where the graduate students are there with their advisor. I'm holding my hood on my hand, on my arm, and then I had to give it to Jim. And then I had to turn around so that Jim could put the hood over my head. And I'll never get this because so I'm standing looking either way, and I see the hood come over. And then Jim grabs me by the shoulders and like spins me around. Because we only had like 2 seconds before I had to go across the stage and like shake Mary Sue Coleman's hand. And he turned me around and he like, how much was it? He's like, Sarah, I'm so proud of you. And I was just absolutely floored by that. I was like, wow, okay, we're having this moment where we have like 2 seconds to process this. So now that I have a little more time, 25 years since I first met you, I wanted to say I am honored to be here and very proud to be your student.
A few minutes for questions. So people have questions for any of our three presenters. Yeah.
We're going to say, Jim.
There are no questions. By the way, those were great. That was awesome. Thank you. All right. Jim, you have the floor.
I'm supposed to be short, right?
Well, I mean, you know, I don't know. You can answer
Comes with the age, you get short.
whatever. Don't jump off the fence though.
I can't. I actually don't do that anymore because I'm really afraid one of these years I'm just going to. I can send you. Okay, so let me say, Ken wanted me to be brief. He also wanted me to talk a little bit about it. I first want to thank all of you for coming. You know, those of you who traveled far here, it's really nice seeing your friends, people I've known for decades. Happy to come and share. My colleagues who come as well, my performance students who take time on one of the few times they can actually do something else and they want to spend it. I also want to thank, it's very nice to have my wife, Karen, her children, Jackie and David. I hope they have a little bit better understanding of sort of. Yeah, he's not so sure. I also want to mention one person who obviously can't be here. And I feel obligated to mention that, which is my good friend, the late Bob Powell. Bob's untimely death several years ago took him away from us, which is a great loss, both for me personally and also for the field. It's really sad he couldn't be. You know, it's simply not possible for him to be here. I'm pretty sure he would have come. So Ken asked me to say a little bit about what I'm up to now. I'll try and be relatively brief. Some of you have probably heard some of this already in one form or another, but I thought I'd mention it. So as I'm approaching retirement, one of those things to think about is you want to change what you do. And as somebody who originally comes from a science background, you know, one of those things in science fields is it's really common for prominent scientists to take time to write popular books and communicate things about their field to the non-academic audience. And I'm doing something, I'm sort of in the early stages of doing something parallel to. So I want to pivot as I go into retirement to write popular books. That is, books that will communicate things I've learned about politics to the interested non-academic audience. And I got 4 of them. I'm busy for a little bit. And some of these, you see, I'll talk about in more length though. So the first one I want to talk about is one I've actually started working on. It's one which I have taught a course on for like the last 5 or 6 years. This is kind of a hard project to describe. So as I put it in one sentence, it's a book about why is the world organized the way it is. Why do we have a world of sovereign states with sort of that organization at the international level, but also how states are governed internally? And so what that book is essentially is it's 500 years of history. It's about why did something that started in Western Europe around 1500 manage to replicate itself all around? And the argument the book develops is it's actually an interaction of 4 different processes. One of those is what I call international conventions and institutions, which is why is it that at different times leaders can come together and create institutions that allow them to bracket off certain issues and remove them from the table, or at least move them from active contention, while allowing others to go on that way. One of the big things that has changed over the centuries is what international politics is about, what issues are important, has changed profoundly. The second one is about the development of the state, governance of the state. Because another big change in the last 500 years is the creation, you know, from what were very, very residual governing organizations in the late medieval period, we now have the modern state that penetrates things, but also the way in which the state is run and who gets to make decisions on behalf of the state has profoundly changed. The third of these is economic growth, because in the long run, that's a big thing that determines who wins international contests in the long run. The fourth is the relationship between Europe and the world. Because another part of this arc over the last 500 years is from Western Europe in 1500 is, well, actually in 1492 is not clearly a really important part of the world. And of course, over the centuries, it grows to the point where if you go to 1914, the Europeans were at the peak of their power, and now this receded back the other way. And the trick is, well, why do you have to do all 4? Because most people write books like this right on one of the 4. Well, the trick is you have to talk about all four of them because they all affect each other. And so you can't just pull one out and act like the others are constant because they all affect one another. And so this book of 500 years. It's not just straight history because it's analytic history. Trying to explain what's going on in these processes at different periods of time. So that's book number one. That's the one I have started to write on. Like I said, I've taught on this. It's a way for me to practice. The second book is I spent most of my life studying war. A lot of it military history as well. I have a lot of things to say. So the second book is a book of essays on. Now, unlike the first book, it doesn't have a single coherent argument. But the simplest way I can explain this to you. So people often use war as an analogy for football. You've got the blitz, you've got the bomb. It's football war. Well, this is a book using football as an analogy for war, at least for some of the essays, not all of them. And that, of course, is kind of all over the place, but it's just a lot of things I want to say. And would you want to write a book on war? It's simple. Lots of people read war books. Well, lots of guys read them. The third book is the one where I actually have the title. And if I tell you the title, you'll get it, which is Life is a Game. Which is, again, another thing I've spent a hell of a lot of time doing is thinking about the world of game theory. Game theory has a number of very broad, general, very deep points about social life. And what that book does is it communicates those people to an audience. It brings them all out. Each chapter will have a distinctive, aphorism for it, something that's short and memorable. But it's again to say, here are things you don't understand about social life because you haven't thought about the strategic side. The last book is the least well defined. Both 2 and 3, I have lists of what the chapters are and I have good ideas what happens in a lot of the chapters and the fourth book, you'll pick up and you'll get to see where this connects me back to those two and what they talked about, which is the last book is a book about public policy. And it makes the following point. What you want government to do and politicians to do is create public goods. That is, things that broadly benefit everyone in society that are not excludable and are commonly jointly produced. And the reason why you want to do that is because it's hard to get markets to do those things. And that's sort of what you want them to do. Problem is, politicians really want to create benefits. That is, things they can give just to their supporters, because that keeps them more loyal. And politicians are endlessly creative at the ways they can turn things into private benefits. Here's the hook now. The problem is almost every public policy produces both some public goods and some private benefits. So there are very few policies that are just purely one or purely, they do some of them. And here's the trick. Politicians always want private benefits. They want to sell it to you as public goods. And indeed, one of the biggest problems in public policy is how do you tell the difference between those two? So you get the politicians to do the things that are broadly beneficial for society rather than the things that are good for their immediate supporters. But so that's sort of where I'm going and we'll be doing the next few years. Yeah, thank you all for coming. It means a lot to me.
That's it. So there's some people from out of towners and those who've been directly invited. There's a dinner at 6, so we'll see you there. Okay.